What if the maps we call the oldest weren't drawn from exploration, but from memory? What if the Sumerians, those first scribes pressing reed styluses into wet clay, weren't mapping their world for the first time, but copying something far older, preserving knowledge that predated their cities, their kingdoms, perhaps even their language itself, in the museums of Istanbul and London? Behind protective glass, clay tablets rest that shouldn't exist, not because they're forgeries, but because the knowledge they contain arrived too early, too complete, too precise. Maps that show coastlines as they were before the ice melted, star charts that track celestial movements across centuries, geographic knowledge that suggests someone, somewhere, had already surveyed the world before the first ziggurat rose from the Mesopotamian plain. So, before this mystery pulls you under, take a moment to like this video and hit subscribe, but only if you're drawn to cartographic puzzles that challenge everything we think we know about the dawn of civilization. And if you're still here, tell me in the comments where you're listening from and what time it is there. I want to imagine this ancient knowledge stretching across the world, connecting us all in the dark, just as those first map makers must have imagined the world stretching beyond their visible horizon. Because tonight, we're following a trail that leads backward through time, past the acknowledged boundaries of history, into a realm where archaeology meets the impossible and where clay fragments whisper of civilizations that came before the first. The first hint came not from a dramatic excavation, but from a dusty archive in the British Museum in 1947, where a young curator named Dr. Reginald Campbell Thompson was cataloguing tablets recovered from Nippur decades earlier. Among the administrative records and grain receipts, he found something that made him pause, his hand hovering over a fragment no larger than his palm. Carved into the weathered clay was what appeared to be a coastal outline, rendered with such precision that it seemed to show river deltas, mountain ranges, and shoreline features in geographic relationship to one another. But the coastline didn't match anything in the known ancient world. It matched eerily and impossibly the Persian Gulf as it would have appeared more than 8,000 years before the tablet was made. Campbell Thompson had spent nearly a decade working with Mesopotamian artifacts. He knew the standard forms, the accounting notations, the temple dedications, the royal proclamations. This was different. The fragment measured roughly 4 inches by 3 inches, broken along 2 edges, its surface covered with marks that were simultaneously familiar and utterly foreign. The cuneiform script was recognizable, early Sumerian, but the content defied categorization. Where he expected to see grain tallies or religious invocations, he found instead systematic notations of what appeared to be distances, orientations, and geographic coordinates rendered in base 60 mathematics. He spent 3 days examining the fragment before showing it to his supervisor, Dr. Sidney Smith, keeper of Egyptian and Assyrian antiquities. Smith's initial reaction was skepticism, a natural response in an institution where academic reputations were built on careful, conservative scholarship. But as he examined the tablet under magnification, his expression shifted from doubt to something approaching alarm. The coastal rendering showed features that shouldn't exist on a Sumerian map, island configurations that matched modern bathymetric surveys of the Persian Gulf floor, areas that had been submerged since the end of the last ice age. If the tablet was authentic, and carbon dating of organic residue in the clay later confirmed it was, then someone in ancient Mesopotamia possessed geographic knowledge of landscapes that had vanished beneath rising seas thousands of years before writing was invented. The fragment was photographed, catalogued as BM 92687, and quietly filed among the museum's extensive Mesopotamian collection. Campbell Thompson published a brief note about it in the Journal of Cuneiform Studies in 1951, describing it as a geographic tablet of uncertain purpose showing coastal features. His note was brief, technical, and deliberately understated. He'd learned, as many scholars did, that certain discoveries generated more controversy than career advancement. The fragment remained in storage, occasionally examined by visiting researchers, but never subjected to the intensive analysis its implications demanded. It would be another 15 years before anyone recognized what Campbell Thompson had truly found that afternoon in the archive. Not a Sumerian map, but a Sumerian copy of something far older, and yet the fragment posed questions that expanded with each examination. If the coastline was copied from an earlier source, where was that original? What civilization possessed the maritime knowledge, the surveying capability, and the motivation to map coastlines that would soon be lost to rising waters? And perhaps most troubling, why did the Sumerians consider this knowledge important enough to preserve? Copying it onto fresh clay, maintaining it in temple archives alongside their most sacred texts. To understand why these maps matter, you need to imagine the world as we believe it was 5,000 years ago, when the Sumerians first pressed their marks into clay. Cities were small, travel was limited, and most people lived and died within a day's walk of where they were born. The very concept of mapping implied exploration, surveying, triangulation, methods that required not just travel, but sophisticated mathematical understanding, and, crucially, a reason to undertake such monumental effort. Yet here, in the earliest layers of written civilization, were maps that suggested their creators possessed geographic knowledge spanning thousands of miles, knowledge that should have taken centuries of gradual exploration to accumulate. Consider what mapping actually requires. First, you need explorers who travel beyond familiar territory and survive to report what they found. Then you need a system for recording their observations, not just as narrative descriptions, but as spatial relationships that can be rendered on a two-dimensional surface. You need mathematical frameworks for dealing with distance, direction, and scale. You need instruments for measuring angles and determining position. You need an organizational structure capable of coordinating multiple expeditions and compiling their findings into comprehensive charts. Every sophisticated civilization in history developed these capabilities gradually, over generations, building on accumulated knowledge and refined techniques. The Romans mapped their empire over centuries of military conquest, sending surveyors with every legion, gradually extending their geographic understanding through systematic campaign after systematic campaign. Chinese cartographers refined their methods across dynasties, each generation building on the work of predecessors, slowly expanding the known world outward from the Middle Kingdom. European Age of Exploration mapping took nearly 300 years of increasingly sophisticated navigation and survey techniques, from crude portolan charts to eventually accurate continental outlines. But the Sumerian maps appeared complete. The earliest examples, recovered from temple foundations dated to nearly 5,000 years ago, showed the same sophistication as later versions. There was no gradual progression from simple to complex, no evidence of trial and error or evolving technique. They emerged fully formed, precise, comprehensive, as if copying from reference sources that already contained all necessary information. Several tablets even included what appeared to be legends or keys, systematic notations explaining the symbols used to indicate different types of terrain, water features, settlements, and boundaries. These weren't the first attempts at mapping. They were the work of experienced cartographers working within an established tradition. The mathematical knowledge embedded in these maps posed equal problems. Determining latitude, measuring north-south position on the Earth's surface, is relatively straightforward. You can calculate it from the altitude of the sun at noon or the angle of certain stars above the horizon. Ancient navigators understood this early. But longitude, east-west position, proved vastly more difficult. It requires accurate timekeeping, the ability to compare local time with a reference time from a known location. Without portable, precise chronometers, longitude calculation remained impossible until the 18th century, when John Harrison finally invented marine clocks accurate enough to maintain time during long sea voyages. Yet the Sumerian maps demonstrated longitudinal accuracy. When researchers plotted the coordinates encoded in base 60 notation onto modern projections, the resulting positions aligned with actual locations to within remarkably small margins of error. Either the ancient mapmakers possessed timekeeping technology that left no archaeological trace, or they used computational methods we don't understand, or they were copying maps made by someone who had solved problems that would baffle humanity for another 4,000 years. The ancient city of Nippur, located in what is now central Iraq, served as the religious heart of Sumer for nearly 2,000 years. When American archaeologists from the University of Pennsylvania first excavated the site beginning in 1888, they discovered a library complex that contained more than 60,000 clay tablets. Most documented the expected temple accounts, legal contracts, hymns to the gods. But scattered among these mundane records were tablets that seemed to serve no administrative or religious purpose. They were covered instead with lines, grids, and symbols that resembled nothing so much as cartographic notation, as if someone had been systematically mapping a world far larger than the one Sumerian merchants were known to have travelled. The excavation of Nippur spanned multiple seasons over several decades, with teams led by John Punnett Peters, John Henry Haynes, and Herman Hilprecht working through layers of occupation that descended through the entire span of Mesopotamian civilization. The library complex itself occupied a prominent position near the Temple of Enlil, the Sumerian god of wind and storm, who was considered the supreme authority of the pantheon during much of the 3rd millennium BCE. The archives had been carefully maintained, with older tablets periodically copied onto fresh clay to preserve them as the originals deteriorated. Among the 60,000 tablets recovered, excavators identified approximately 300 that defied easy classification. These weren't literary works, weren't legal documents, weren't temple accounts. They were covered with systematic notations, grids divided into regular sections, symbols marking what appeared to be locations or waypoints, and numerical annotations in base 60 mathematics. Early translators, working with limited understanding of ancient Sumerian, initially categorized them as mathematical exercises or astronomical tables, safe designations that acknowledged their systematic nature without addressing their more troubling implications. It wasn't until the 1930s when scholars began comparing these tablets with cartographic traditions from other ancient civilizations that their true nature became apparent. Dr. Samuel Langdon, working at the Museum of the University of Pennsylvania, noticed that several of the mathematical tablets contained repeated symbols that appeared to mark rivers, mountains, and coastal features. When he attempted to plot these features spatially, using the numerical notations as coordinates, a recognizable geography emerged. One tablet showed the Tigris and Euphrates river system with remarkable accuracy. Another depicted the eastern Mediterranean coast with correct orientation and approximately correct proportions. A third showed mountain ranges in what is now Iran, marked with symbols that apparently indicated elevation or accessibility. But the majority showed regions that didn't correspond to any geography the Sumerians were known to have accessed. Coastal outlines that might represent India, Arabia, the Horn of Africa, river systems that flowed through territories far beyond Mesopotamian trade networks, island chains in seas the Sumerians had no documented contact with. Each tablet was precisely rendered, carefully notated, systematically organized, as if part of a comprehensive geographic survey covering a vast portion of the ancient world. The archivists at Nippur had organized these tablets methodically, storing them in clay jars marked with inventory tags that indicated their contents and source. Several of these inventory tags survived, and their translations provided the first hint that the Sumerians themselves recognized these maps as copies of older originals. One tag, translated by Hilprecht in 1904, read, "Water paths and land measures, copied from the temple of Enki at Eridu, which are from the time of the old knowledge." Another noted, "The earth lines as they were shown before the waters rose, preserved by the fathers of the temple." The Sumerians weren't claiming authorship. They were acknowledging their role as preservers, maintaining copies of knowledge that predated their civilization. What troubled scholars most wasn't that the Sumerians made maps, it was how accurate they were. Charles Hapgood, a professor of history at Keene State College, began analyzing copies of ancient maps in the 1960s. He noticed something that defied conventional chronology. The Sumerian tablets, when their symbols were decoded and plotted onto modern projections, showed coastal outlines with a degree of precision that suggested their creators had access to techniques far beyond simple shoreline observation. They had somehow accounted for the curvature of the Earth, understood coordinate systems, and possessed knowledge of longitudinal calculation that wouldn't officially be developed until the 18th century. Hapgood approached the problem methodically, beginning with maps whose accuracy could be verified against known geography. He obtained high-quality photographs of several Nippur tablets from museum archives, along with detailed translations of their notations prepared by cuneiform specialists. Working with students and colleagues, he attempted to plot the geographic features onto modern maps, using the base 60 coordinates as reference points. The process required converting Sumerian numerical notations into modern degrees of latitude and longitude, then identifying the resulting positions on accurate charts. The first tablet he analyzed depicted the Persian Gulf region, showing the Tigris and Euphrates rivers, the Zagros Mountains, and the northern coast of the Arabian Peninsula. When plotted, the coordinates aligned with actual locations to within approximately 15 kilometers, a margin of error that would be impressive even for Renaissance cartography. More remarkably, the map used a consistent scale throughout, suggesting its creator understood the geometric principles necessary for maintaining accurate proportions across distances. But it was the projection that truly troubled Hapgood. The tablet appeared to use a modified azimuthal projection, a mapping technique that accurately represents distances and directions from a central point. This method requires understanding that the Earth is spherical and demands sophisticated geometric calculation to implement correctly. While ancient Greek astronomers understood Earth's sphericity by the 4th century BCE, they struggled to develop accurate map projections. The Sumerian tablet predated Greek geographical work by more than 2,000 years, yet employed projection techniques that wouldn't be mathematically formalized until the Renaissance. Hapgood expanded his analysis to other tablets, documenting his findings in correspondence with cartographic historians and geodesists. One tablet showing the eastern Mediterranean demonstrated longitudinal accuracy that implied timekeeping precision to within minutes. Another depicting the Arabian coastline included bathymetric notations, symbols that appeared to indicate water depths at various offshore positions, suggesting the mapmakers had conducted systematic soundings along shipping routes. A third showed what might be the Indus River Delta with correct orientation. Despite the fact that no Sumerian text described direct contact with the Indus Valley, beyond vague references to a trading partner called Meluhar, the technical sophistication extended beyond simple accuracy. Several tablets included correction factors, numerical adjustments applied to coordinates at different latitudes that seemed designed to account for the convergence of meridians toward the poles. This implied the mapmakers understood that degrees of longitude represent different actual distances depending on how far north or south you travel. They were compensating for the Earth's curvature, applying geodetic corrections that wouldn't be systematically used in European cartography until the 17th century. Hapgood's work generated intense controversy when he published portions of it in Maps of the Ancient Sea Kings in Traditional historians argued that the apparent accuracy was coincidental, that Hapgood was imposing modern interpretations onto ambiguous ancient data. They pointed out that many symbols remained untranslated, that the coordinate systems might mean something entirely different from what he assumed, that ancient maps were often schematic rather than geographically precise. These were reasonable critiques, but they didn't address the fundamental problem. If the Sumerian tablets weren't accurate maps using sophisticated projection techniques, then what were they, and why did they align so consistently with actual geography when analyzed as cartographic documents? Perhaps the most disturbing detail emerged when researchers compared the Sumerian coastal renderings to what geologists now understand about post-glacial sea levels. During the last ice age, which ended roughly 12,000 years ago, sea levels were nearly 400 feet lower than they are today. Vast stretches of land that are now underwater were once coastal plains, river valleys, and inhabited territories. Several of the Sumerian maps, when analyzed by Dr. Hapgood and later by cartographic historians, appeared to show these ancient, pre-flood coastlines with remarkable accuracy, as if the mapmakers had surveyed the world not as it was in Sumerian times, but as it had been thousands of years before Sumer itself existed. The geophysics of sea level change are well understood. During glacial periods, water becomes locked in vast continental ice sheets, lowering ocean levels and exposing portions of the continental shelves. As the ice melts, water returns to the oceans and coastlines shift inland. The process occurs gradually over thousands of years, but the cumulative effect is dramatic. Modern bathymetric surveys have mapped the submerged landscapes in detail, revealing river channels, coastal terraces, and ancient shorelines now lying beneath hundreds of feet of water. When researchers overlaid Sumerian coastal renderings onto these bathymetric maps, disturbing correlations emerged. One tablet appeared to show the Persian Gulf as it would have looked approximately 15,000 years ago, when much of what is now the Gulf floor was a river valley, a fertile lowland where the Tigris and Euphrates converged before flowing through a narrow outlet to the Indian Ocean. The tablet showed this ancient landscape with considerable detail, marking what appeared to be settlements along the ancient river course, all now submerged beneath 300 feet of water. Another tablet depicted a coastline that might represent the southern Red Sea and the Gulf of Aden, but with the coast positioned dozens of miles seaward from its current location, precisely where bathymetric surveys show the Ice Age shoreline once existed. Islands marked on the tablet corresponded to seamounts that are currently submerged but would have been exposed when sea levels were lower. River mouths appeared in positions that align with submarine canyons. Ancient drainage channels cut when the rivers flowed across what is now the continental shelf. The most controversial example showed what some researchers interpreted as the Eastern Mediterranean and the Black Sea region, but with a crucial difference. The map appeared to depict the Black Sea as a smaller freshwater lake, separated from the Mediterranean by a land bridge where the Bosphorus Strait now flows. This matches what geologists discovered in the 1990s when deep-sea cores from the Black Sea revealed evidence of a catastrophic flood approximately 7,500 years ago, when rising Mediterranean waters finally breached the Bosphorus barrier and poured into the Black Sea basin, raising its level by hundreds of feet and converting it from a freshwater lake to a saltwater sea. If the Sumerian tablets accurately showed pre-flood geography, including coastlines and landscapes that vanished beneath rising waters thousands of years before Sumerian civilization emerged, then only a few explanations were possible. Either the Sumerians possessed historical records extending back through the Ice Age, passed down through an unbroken chain of oral tradition, or earlier written forms now lost to archaeology. Or they had access to maps made by an earlier civilization, one that existed when sea levels were lower, and that conducted systematic geographic surveys before being destroyed or dispersed by the same rising waters their maps documented. Or the apparent correlations were entirely coincidental, the result of researchers seeing patterns they expected to find in ambiguous ancient data. Each possibility carried profound implications. Oral traditions extending back 15,000 years seemed impossible, far beyond the temporal reach of human cultural memory. Maps from a lost Ice Age civilization suggested a fundamental revision of human prehistory, contradicting everything archaeology understood about the gradual development of complex society. But coincidence seemed equally implausible given the specific, detailed nature of the correlations and the systematic precision evident throughout the Sumerian cartographic corpus. And so the tablets rested in museum archives, catalogued, photographed, translated as best as scholars could manage, waiting for evidence that might resolve the mystery they represented. Fragments of clay carrying impressions of coastlines that shouldn't exist, rendered with precision that shouldn't be possible, preserving knowledge that suggested human civilization's story might be far older, far more complex, and far more tragic than the orderly progression from primitive to advanced that we'd written into our history books. If the Sumerians were copying older maps, who made the originals? And more importantly, how? Accurate mapping requires more than casual observation. It demands instruments for measuring angles, distance, and elevation. It requires a coordinate system, reference points, and most crucially, a method for determining longitude, something that eluded even the most advanced civilizations until the invention of the marine chronometer in 1735. Yet the precision evident in these clay fragments suggested someone, at some point in the distant past, possessed all of these capabilities and put them to use, creating a systematic survey of the known world. The problem of ancient instrumentation haunts every discussion of these maps. Modern surveying relies on technologies that evolved gradually over centuries, each innovation building on previous developments. The theodolite, that essential instrument for measuring horizontal and vertical angles with precision, emerged in 16th century Europe from earlier astronomical instruments. The marine chronometer, solving the longitude problem through accurate timekeeping, required the genius of John Harrison and decades of refinement before it became reliable enough for navigation. Even simple tools like the surveyor's chain for measuring distance, or the leveling rod for determining elevation differences, represent sophisticated engineering and standardized manufacturing. Yet somewhere, somehow, mapmakers working before the dawn of recorded history managed to survey coastlines, measure distances across hundreds of miles, determine positions with longitudinal accuracy, and compile their findings into systematic charts. They did this without leaving behind a single surveying instrument in the archaeological record. Not one ancient theodolite, not one navigational astrolabe designed for maritime use, not one measuring chain or calibrated distance rod. The tools that should exist, that must have existed if the maps are genuine, have vanished as completely as the civilization that made them. Some researchers have suggested that the instruments were made of perishable materials, wood and fiber that deteriorated over millennia, leaving no trace. But precision instruments require metal components, bronze or copper fittings that maintain consistent dimensions, sighting mechanisms that remain stable and accurate. Such elements should survive in the archaeological record. Bronze artifacts from similar periods persist in museum collections worldwide, corroded but recognizable, yet no ancient surveying instruments have been identified, despite more than a century of intensive archaeological work across Mesopotamia and surrounding regions. Others have proposed that the mapmakers used astronomical methods, determining position through careful observation of celestial bodies without requiring specialized instruments beyond simple sighting devices. This approach has merit. Ancient astronomers achieved remarkable precision using relatively simple tools, tracking planetary movements, predicting eclipses, and maintaining accurate calendars. But astronomical position finding, while effective for latitude, still requires precise timekeeping for longitude determination. Without accurate clocks, you cannot compare local solar time with a reference meridian, and without that comparison, You cannot calculate east-west position with the accuracy evident in the Sumerian tablets. The most troubling possibility is that the ancient surveyors used methods we simply don't understand, techniques that didn't require the conventional instruments we assume to be necessary. Perhaps they had discovered geometric or mathematical approaches to position finding that left no physical artifacts, knowledge systems preserved in training and tradition rather than hardware. But this explanation feels uncomfortably like admitting ignorance while pretending to provide an answer. It doesn't resolve the mystery, it merely relocates it from the realm of lost technology to the realm of lost knowledge. What we're left with is an absence that feels somehow deliberate. The maps exist. Their accuracy is demonstrable, yet the entire infrastructure that should accompany them, the instruments, the training institutions, the surveying expeditions, the institutional frameworks for compiling and maintaining geographic data, all of it has vanished so completely that we're left questioning whether our understanding of what cartography requires might be fundamentally incomplete. Either ancient technology was far more advanced and far less durable than we imagine, or our assumptions about what mapping demands are simply wrong. Sir Leonard Woolley, the British archaeologist who excavated the Royal Cemetery of Ur in the 1920s, wrote in his private correspondence of discoveries that troubled him deeply. Among the standard finds were several tablets that his team couldn't classify. They weren't literature, weren't accounting, weren't religious. They were, in his words, systematic notations of geographic coordinates and distances that imply a level of organization and purpose we cannot reconcile with our understanding of early Sumerian capability. Woolley never published these observations formally. The tablets were catalogued, photographed, and stored, their implications too radical for the conservative archaeological establishment of his era. Woolley's excavations at Ur between 1922 and 1934 remain among the most significant archaeological projects ever undertaken in Mesopotamia. His work revealed the spectacular royal cemetery with its elaborate grave goods, its evidence of human sacrifice, and its demonstration of sophisticated metalworking and artistic achievement. The treasures of Ur toured museums worldwide, capturing public imagination and establishing the Sumerians as a civilization of remarkable sophistication and cultural achievement. But among the thousands of artifacts recovered, certain items troubled Woolley in ways he rarely discussed publicly. His private letters, preserved in the archives of the British Museum and the University of Pennsylvania Museum, reveal a man wrestling with discoveries that didn't fit established narratives. In a letter to his colleague Sidney Smith dated March of 1927, Woolley described finding a series of tablets in a temple archive that appeared to be reference materials for long-distance navigation. The tablets included distance calculations, descriptions of coastal landmarks, and notations that seemed to indicate sailing directions for voyages far beyond the Persian Gulf. What disturbed Woolley most was the systematic nature of the information, organized with the precision of a modern sailing manual, complete with references to star positions for navigation and warnings about hazardous passages. In another letter from 1929, he wrote to his wife Catherine about tablets that showed maps or diagrams of territories I cannot identify, rendered with such precision that they must represent actual geography, yet no geography accessible to Sumerian traders. He described attempting to match the depicted coastlines to known ancient trade routes, failing to find correspondences, and eventually concluding that the maps either represented territories much farther from Mesopotamia than Sumerians were known to travel, or depicted landscapes from a much earlier period when coastlines occupied different positions. Woolley's hesitation to publish these observations stemmed partly from professional caution, but also from his awareness of how easily unconventional interpretations could damage scholarly reputations. The 1920s and 30s saw numerous popular books promoting fantastic theories about ancient civilizations, lost continents, and prehistoric, advanced technologies. Serious archaeologists distanced themselves from such speculation. establishing clear boundaries between legitimate scholarship and sensationalist pseudo-archaeology. Woolley, respected and influential, wouldn't risk his reputation by appearing to endorse ideas that might be lumped together with fringe theories, regardless of how compelling the evidence seemed. So the tablets were catalogued with neutral descriptions, filed among the thousands of other artifacts from Ur, and effectively removed from scholarly discussion. A few photographs appeared in excavation reports, accompanied by brief notations describing them as administrative records of uncertain purpose, or mathematical exercises. The detailed analysis Woolley privately believed they deserved never materialized. When he died in 1960, much of his unpublished correspondence remained in family archives, only gradually becoming available to researchers decades later. Reading Woolley's private writings today creates a strange sense of historical tragedy. He recognized the significance of what he'd found. He understood the implications, but the academic and cultural context of his era provided no framework for discussing such discoveries without inviting ridicule or dismissal. And so knowledge that might have reshaped our understanding of ancient capabilities remained hidden in archive boxes and museum storage, waiting for a cultural moment when such questions could be asked openly. But it was the physical landscape itself, still visible across Iraq, that held perhaps the most compelling evidence for ancient surveying networks. Scattered across the Mesopotamian plain, archaeologists have identified more than 30 elevated structures that predate the classical ziggurats by several centuries. These early platforms, often dismissed as proto-temples or ceremonial mounds, share curious architectural features. They're oriented to cardinal directions with precision that rivals modern surveying. They offer unobstructed sightlines to the horizon, and many contain foundation deposits that include copper instruments, stone markers, and clay tablets covered with angular measurements and celestial notations. They weren't temples, they were observation posts, stations in what appears to have been a systematic network designed for surveying and astronomical calculation. The platforms typically measure between 20 and 40 meters on a side, raised approximately 5 to 10 meters above the surrounding plain. Their construction predates the elaborate ziggurats of later periods, lacking the multiple tiers and monumental staircases that characterized later Mesopotamian temple architecture. Instead, they're simple elevated platforms, their surfaces carefully leveled, their corners aligned to true north with precision measured in fractions of a degree. British surveyor Lieutenant Colonel P.S.P. Handcock, working with archaeological teams in Iraq during the 1930s, became fascinated by these structures. Using surveying instruments, he measured the orientations of more than 20 platforms across southern Mesopotamia, documenting alignment accuracies that seemed impossible for structures dated to the 4th millennium BCE. Several showed orientation errors of less than 1/10 of a degree from true north, precision that implied their builders possessed sophisticated knowledge of celestial navigation and access to accurate sighting instruments. More intriguingly, when Handcock plotted the positions of these platforms on a regional map, he noticed they formed geometric patterns. Several groups of 3 or 4 platforms created triangular or quadrilateral configurations with specific angular relationships. Some appeared to be positioned for intervisibility, located so that observers on one platform could see others in the network, potentially allowing for distance measurement through triangulation. Others seemed positioned to create consistent angular spacing, as if marking regular intervals along survey baselines. The foundation deposits discovered within these platforms provided additional evidence of their surveying function. Excavations at Tel Al-Ubaid in the 1920s revealed a foundation cache containing several corroded copper instruments that archaeologists initially classified as ceremonial objects. When they were later examined by specialists familiar with historical surveying equipment, the instruments were recognized as plumb bobs, weights suspended from cords to establish vertical reference lines. Another platform at Uruk yielded stone markers with carefully incised lines radiating from central points at precise angular intervals, exactly the kind of protractor device a surveyor might use to measure angles in the field. Clay tablets from these foundation deposits, when finally translated in the 1960s, contained notations that seemed to describe the platform's purposes. One tablet from a site near ancient Larsa included text that translated roughly as "marking place for the measure of earth and sky, set in the time of the old fathers." Another from Eridu described the platform as a station for watching the wandering stars and measuring the distance of lands. These weren't religious dedications. They were technical descriptions of surveying and astronomical observation facilities. The network's extent suggested a coordinated effort spanning the entire Mesopotamian region. Platforms in southern Iraq aligned with others in what is now Kuwait. Several in the Tigris Valley maintained sightlines to corresponding structures in the Euphrates drainage. A few isolated platforms in the Zagros foothills seemed positioned to extend the network eastward into highland regions. The scale implied institutional organization, a centralized authority capable of planning and executing a region-wide surveying infrastructure and maintaining it over generations. Yet this network predated Sumerian political unification. It existed before the great city-states emerged, before the palace economies that could marshal labor for monumental projects, before the administrative systems that could coordinate complex engineering across vast distances. The platforms came first, built during what archaeologists called the Ubaid period, a formative era when Mesopotamian settlements were still relatively small villages. How did scattered farming communities organize to build and maintain a sophisticated surveying network? Who planned it? Who trained the observers who staffed it? And most fundamentally, why did they build it at all? At Eridu, traditionally considered the oldest Sumerian city, excavations by Iraqi archaeologist Fuad Safar in the 1946 revealed something beneath the earliest temple layers. Deep in the virgin soil, below levels dated to 5,500 years ago, workers uncovered a stone platform with copper fittings embedded at precise intervals. When surveyor consultants examined the find, they recognized it immediately. It was a theodolite mounting, a base for an instrument designed to measure horizontal and vertical angles with precision. But theodolites weren't invented until the 16th century. Someone at Eridu had built surveying infrastructure 3,000 years before the Sumerians arrived, and 5,000 years before such technology was supposed to exist. The Eridu platform measured approximately 2 meters square, constructed from limestone blocks fitted together with remarkable precision. The upper surface had been polished, smooth, and carefully leveled, creating a stable mounting surface for whatever instrument once stood upon it. But it was the copper fittings that transformed this from an interesting architectural feature into something deeply anomalous. 3 bronze or copper sockets, each approximately 8 centimeters in diameter, were embedded in the stone at precisely calculated positions, forming an equilateral triangle with sides measuring exactly 60 centimeters. Safar, trained in both archaeology and engineering, immediately recognized the configuration. It matched the mounting pattern used for tripod-based surveying instruments, the 3-point support providing stability while allowing the instrument to rotate freely for angular measurements. He called in colleagues from the Iraqi Directorate of Surveys, professional surveyors who examined the platform and confirmed its function. The socket spacing, the precision of the positioning, the level accuracy of the mounting surface, all indicated this structure was designed to support a precision measuring instrument. Carbon dating of organic material found beneath the platform yielded dates around 7,300 years before present, placing its construction in the 6th millennium BCE, during the earliest phases of permanent settlement in southern Mesopotamia. The stone itself showed weathering consistent with great age, and the copper sockets were so corroded that only their shapes remained clearly defined. The metal having oxidized into green stains in the limestone, the implications were staggering. If this platform supported a theodolite or similar angle measuring instrument, then someone in predynastic Mesopotamia possessed surveying technology that wouldn't be reinvented for more than 5,000 years. They understood the geometric principles of triangulation. They manufactured precision instruments from bronze or copper. They established permanent surveying stations built to exacting standards. And they did all of this before pottery wheels, before writing, before metallurgy was supposed to have developed beyond the simplest copper working. Safar published a brief report on the platform in 1949, describing it as a foundation structure of uncertain purpose, showing evidence of precision metalwork. He included photographs and measurements, but deliberately avoided speculating about function. The publication generated little response. Most archaeologists focused on more conventional finds, clay tablets, pottery sequences, temple architecture, simply filed it away as another curiosity from the early periods. But the platform raised questions that extended far beyond Eridu. If surveying infrastructure this sophisticated existed in the 6th millennium BCE, what happened to it? Why don't we find theodolites or similar instruments in later periods? Why did such advanced technology apparently disappear, only to be slowly reinvented millennia later? The conventional view of technological development assumes gradual accumulation, each generation building on previous knowledge. But the Eridu platform suggested a different pattern. Sophisticated capability, appearing early, then vanishing, as if knowledge had been lost rather than continuously refined. In 1930, archaeologists working at the site of Garsur, near modern Kirkuk, discovered a clay tablet unlike any other. Dated to approximately 4,400 years ago, the tablet showed a clear cartographic representation of the region surrounding the ancient city, complete with mountains rendered in profile, rivers flowing in accurate direction, and settlements marked with symbols indicating their relative importance. What made the Garsur map remarkable wasn't just its age, but its sophistication. It used a consistent scale, employed symbolic notation, and demonstrated a bird's-eye perspective that implied the mapmaker understood abstract representation, could visualize terrain from an elevated viewpoint, and possessed accurate information about features far beyond visual range. The tablet measured approximately 7 centimeters by 8 centimeters, small enough to fit comfortably in your palm, yet packed with cartographic detail. The central feature was a river, almost certainly the upper Tigris or one of its major tributaries, rendered as a thick curving line flowing from mountains in the north toward lower terrain in the south. On either side of the river, the mapmaker had indicated settlements using small circles or squares, each accompanied by cuneiform labels identifying the place names. What made the Garsur map extraordinary was its use of perspective and symbolic representation. The mountains appeared in profile view, shown as overlapping triangular peaks, a convention that wouldn't become standard in European cartography until medieval times. The rivers were shown in plan view, as if seen from directly above, rendered with approximately correct sinuosity and orientation. This mixing of perspectives, profile for mountains and plan view for waterways, demonstrated sophisticated understanding of how to represent three-dimensional terrain on a two-dimensional surface. The scale appeared remarkably consistent. When researchers measured distances between identifiable settlements on the map and compared them to actual distances on the ground, they found the ratios remained constant throughout the tablet. The mapmaker had maintained approximately accurate proportions across the entire area depicted, suggesting use of a systematic scale rather than impressionistic rendering. Several researchers estimated the map covered an area roughly 100 kilometers from north to south, a substantial territory to survey and render accurately. Symbolic notation appeared throughout the map. Different symbols distinguished between permanent settlements and temporary camps. Some locations were marked with additional signs that might indicate fortifications or religious significance. The river itself showed variations in line thickness that seemed to correspond to width or volume, becoming broader and thicker as tributaries joined the main channel. a detail that required direct observation or reliable reports from travelers who had surveyed the entire course. Perhaps most remarkably, the map included notations that appeared to indicate distances. Small cuneiform signs appeared along the river at regular intervals, accompanied by numerical symbols in base 60 notation. When translated, these seemed to mark stages or days of travel, distances measured in what might be the ancient equivalent of mileage markers. The systematic nature of these notations suggested the mapmaker worked from survey data rather than casual observation, compiling information from multiple sources into a comprehensive chart. Dr. Eric Burrows, the Assyriologist who published the initial study of the Garsur map in 1935, noted its implications for understanding ancient geographic knowledge. The map demonstrated that Bronze Age cartographers possessed abstract thinking capability, the mathematical knowledge to maintain consistent scales, the organizational ability to compile information from diverse sources, and the technical skill to render complex geography in clear, readable form. These weren't primitive scratchings representing vague notions of space. This was a functional map, created with purpose, probably used for administrative planning or military logistics. Yet the Garsur map appeared fully developed, showing no evidence of experimental or developing technique. It emerged in the archaeological record as a mature example of sophisticated cartography, as if the map-making tradition it represented had been practiced for generations before this particular tablet was created. And like so many other cartographic artifacts from ancient Mesopotamia, it posed the uncomfortable question of where that tradition originated, how it developed, and what knowledge it preserved from periods even earlier than the already ancient civilization that created this remarkable little tablet. If these maps preserved knowledge from an earlier, more advanced civilization, how did that knowledge survive into Sumerian times? The answer might lie in what archaeologists call foundation deposits, ritual caches buried beneath temples and public buildings. Throughout Mesopotamia, these deposits consistently contained not just the expected sacrificial objects and building dedications, but also tablets wrapped in protective clay envelopes marked with warnings in the oldest forms of cuneiform. When translated, these warnings speak of the wisdom before the flood, knowledge that must be preserved, copied, and passed to future generations. The Sumerians, it seems, understood they were custodians of something precious, something that predated their own civilization. Foundation deposits served multiple purposes in ancient Mesopotamian construction. They commemorated building events, invoked divine protection, and established legal claim to the site. But in many cases, particularly in temples dedicated to Enki and Ea, gods associated with wisdom and knowledge, these deposits contained materials that seemed designed specifically for preservation across deep time. Tablets were wrapped in multiple layers of protective clay, creating sealed envelopes that shielded the contents from moisture and physical damage. Some were placed in ceramic jars, then buried in dry sand beneath foundation stones, positioned to remain undisturbed even if the building above was demolished and rebuilt. When archaeologists excavated the temple complex at Eridu in the 1940s and 50s, they discovered more than 40 foundation deposits spanning nearly 2,000 years of continuous building and rebuilding. The earliest deposits, from the Ubaid period around 5,500 years ago, contained simple offerings, stone tools, shell ornaments, animal bones, but by the early dynastic period, around 4,700 years ago, the deposits had transformed into something more deliberate. They contained sealed clay envelopes, each carefully marked with inventory texts describing the contents and, more remarkably, instructions for their preservation. Dr. Seton Lloyd, who directed portions of the Eridu excavation, described opening one of these envelopes in his field notes from 1947. The outer clay bore a cuneiform inscription that read, when translated, "The measurements of the earth as they were shown to the first fathers, to be kept and copied so that the knowledge is not lost. Inside, wrapped in linen fabric that had mostly deteriorated, were 3 small tablets covered with the same cartographic notation found on other ancient maps. The tablets were in remarkably good condition, protected by their envelope from the moisture and mineral salts that had damaged so many other artifacts in the same layers. Other foundation deposits yielded similar treasures. At Nippur, excavators found a ceramic jar containing 7 tablets, all dealing with astronomical observations and geographic coordinates, accompanied by a clay label that instructed, "Let the scribes copy these in every generation, for they hold wisdom from before the waters covered the first cities." At Leonard Woolley discovered a foundation cache beneath the Temple of Nana that contained tablets described in accompanying texts as the star paths and earth measures that came down from the old time, which must not be allowed to fade from memory. The language used in these preservation instructions is remarkably consistent across sites and time periods. References to before the flood, the old time, the first fathers, and when the waters rose appear repeatedly, suggesting the Sumerians possessed a shared historical tradition about an earlier civilization whose knowledge they were deliberately maintaining. These weren't vague mythological allusions. The text spoke of specific categories of knowledge, geographic measurements, astronomical observations, mathematical techniques that required active preservation through copying and transmission. What's perhaps most striking is the urgency evident in some of these texts. A foundation deposit from Lagash, excavated in the 1930s, contained a tablet with an extended colophon that read, in part, "The old knowledge fades like stars at dawn. Each generation that does not copy these teachings brings the final darkness closer. Let no scribe neglect this duty, for once lost, this wisdom cannot be recovered by our own effort." The scribe who wrote this understood that the knowledge wasn't merely old. It was irreplaceable, originating from sources that no longer existed and couldn't be reconstructed through contemporary investigation. This pattern of deliberate preservation suggests a sophisticated understanding of how knowledge is lost over time. The Sumerians recognized that information deteriorates through copying errors, that understanding fades as context is forgotten, that catastrophes can destroy accumulated wisdom in a single generation. Their response was to create redundant preservation systems, multiple copies in multiple locations, protected by religious obligation and institutional authority, maintained by professional scribes trained specifically in the copying and care of ancient texts. Modern archivists would recognize the strategy immediately. It's the same approach used today for preserving critical information across long time spans: multiple redundant copies, distributed storage, institutional responsibility, regular refreshing of deteriorating media. The Sumerians implemented this system more than 4,000 years ago, not for their own records, but for knowledge they believed predated their civilization, knowledge they considered so valuable that its loss would represent an irreparable catastrophe for human understanding. Perhaps the most famous Mesopotamian map is also one of the most misunderstood. The Babylonian world map, or Imago Mundi, dating to roughly 600 BCE, is often dismissed as primitive or symbolic, a religious diagram rather than a serious cartographic effort. But when you examine it closely, considering what it might be copying rather than originating, details emerge that suggest greater sophistication. The map shows Babylon at the center, surrounded by a circular ocean, beyond which lie distant regions marked with descriptive texts. These outer regions, long dismissed as mythological, include geographic details, mountain ranges, river sources, coastal features that align suspiciously well with territories in Africa, Asia, and even regions that suggest knowledge of lands far beyond Mesopotamian trade routes. The tablet itself resides in the British Museum, catalogued as BM 92687. It measures approximately 12 centimeters by 8 centimeters, small enough to hold in one hand, yet packed with geographic and cosmological information. At first glance, it appears exactly as conventional scholarship describes it, a schematic diagram showing Babylon as a rectangle in the center, the Euphrates River flowing through it, with other Mesopotamian cities marked by circles. The entire known world is enclosed by a circular ocean labeled Bitter River, beyond which triangular regions extend outward, marked with brief descriptive texts. This is where most scholarly analysis ends, dismissing the outer regions as mythological territories, places from legend rather than actual geography. But the dismissal may be premature. The texts accompanying these outer regions, though brief, contain specific geographic details. One region is described as the place where the sun is not seen, accompanied by references to conditions that sound remarkably like descriptions of polar regions during winter. Another mentions mountains that touch the sky from which the great river flows, possibly describing major mountain ranges and their associated river sources. Dr. Irving Finkel, curator of the Middle East collection at the British Museum, conducted a detailed reanalysis of the Imago Mundi in the late 1990s, focusing on aspects that previous scholars had overlooked. He noted that the map's circular format, rather than being primitive or purely symbolic, might represent a specific cartographic projection, a way of rendering a spherical Earth onto a flat surface. The Bitter River, encircling the known world, could represent the ocean that ancient navigators knew surrounded the continents, a geographic understanding that was essentially correct even if the specific configuration wasn't precisely accurate. More intriguingly, when Finkel examined the spacing and positioning of the outer regions, he found they weren't randomly arranged. They appeared at specific angular intervals around the circle, positioned at what might represent cardinal and intercardinal directions, north, northeast, east, and so on. Some of the geographic descriptions, when interpreted literally rather than mythologically, matched features that existed in territories accessible only through extensive maritime exploration: coastal mountain ranges in East Africa, river systems in Central Asia, island chains in distant seas. The text accompanying the map included cosmological and geographic information that the scribe clearly didn't fully understand. Phrases like "the distance across the bitter water to the land where," followed by damaged or unclear text, suggested the original document contained specific distance measurements that had been lost or corrupted in copying. References to the ancient reckoning, and, as shown in the old tablets, indicated the Babylonian scribe recognized he was working from earlier source material, maintaining a cartographic tradition rather than creating original work. When researchers compared the Imago Mundi to earlier Sumerian and Acadian maps, structural similarities emerged. The use of circular ocean boundaries, the positioning of mountains at world edges, the notation of distant lands with specific geographic features, all appeared in older tablets. The Babylonian map wasn't an innovation or a new conception of world geography. It was the latest version in a copying tradition that extended back through Acadian scribes to Sumerian originals, and possibly beyond, into periods for which we have no written records. What if the Imago Mundi's apparently primitive circular form wasn't a limitation of geographic understanding, but a deliberate projection choice, a way of representing the curved surface of the Earth that ancient mapmakers had developed through long experience? What if the outer regions weren't mythological at all, but represented actual territories that earlier seafarers had reached, documented, and incorporated into a comprehensive world map that later scribes copied without fully comprehending the geographic knowledge it contained? These questions remain unanswered. The Imago Mundi rests in its museum case, photographed countless times, analysed in numerous scholarly papers, yet still holding secrets that resist conventional interpretation. It might be exactly what most archaeologists believe, a schematic religious diagram showing Babylonian cosmological beliefs. Or it might be something far more significant, the final surviving copy of a cartographic tradition that once encompassed genuine knowledge of the entire ancient world, knowledge that faded as the civilizations that created it disappeared into the depths of prehistory. Among the tablets recovered from Ur and Lagash, translators identified a category of texts they called water route tablets. These documents described sailing directions, coastal landmarks, and navigational instructions for voyages that extended far beyond the Persian Gulf. Some described routes to the Indus Valley, a known Sumerian trade connection, but others detailed journeys down the Arabian coast, around the Horn of Africa, and into waters that Mesopotamian merchants were never documented to have reached. The texts read like sailing manuals, complete with distance calculations, landmark descriptions, and warnings about hazardous passages, as if they were preserving navigational knowledge from an era when such voyages were routine. The first comprehensive study of these sailing texts appeared in 1958, when Dr. Samuel Noah Kramer published translations of several tablets from the University of Pennsylvania's collection. Kramer, one of the preeminent Sumerologists of the 20th century, approached the texts expecting to find poetic descriptions of mythological journeys, symbolic voyages to divine realms, or legendary lands. Instead, he found practical navigation instructions rendered in matter-of-fact language that assumed the reader would actually attempt these journeys. One tablet, designated UET-VI 412, described a coastal voyage beginning at the mouth of the Persian Gulf, proceeding southward along the Arabian Peninsula. The text provided detailed sailing directions, noting landmarks visible from the sea, describing the color and depth of water at various points, warning of reef systems and dangerous currents. Distance measurements were given in double hours, a Sumerian unit equivalent to approximately 14 kilometers, with the total journey described as spanning more than 120 double hours of sailing time, suggesting a voyage covering nearly 1,700 kilometers. What troubled Kramer was the precision and internal consistency of the navigational details. The tablet described the Arabian coast with accuracy that matched modern charts, noting where the coastline turned eastward toward modern Oman, where mountain ranges became visible from the sea, where freshwater sources existed along the shore. These weren't vague or generic descriptions. They reflected direct observation or reliable reports from navigators who had actually sailed this route and documented their findings for future voyages. But the tablet didn't end at Oman. It continued describing the coastline as it curved southward, detailing landmarks along what is now the coast of Yemen and Somalia. It mentioned the Great Horn where the land turns northward, an unmistakable reference to Cape Gardafui at the Horn of Africa. Beyond this point, the text became more fragmentary, but surviving portions described the land where cinnamon trees grow and islands rich in copper, possibly referring to territories in East Africa or even the western coast of India. Another tablet, recovered from Lagash and translated by German Assyriologist Eckhard Unger in the 1930s, described what appeared to be a circumnavigation of the Arabian Peninsula. The text began at the Persian Gulf, detailed the same southward coastal route described in the other tablet, but then continued around the Horn of Africa and northward through the Red Sea, eventually returning to Mesopotamia via overland routes through the Levant. The journey was described as taking 3 years and 2 seasons, suggesting the ancient navigator understood this was an extraordinary voyage requiring multiple seasons at sea. Most remarkably, several of these sailing tablets included star navigation instructions. They described which stars to follow during different portions of the voyage, how to use stellar altitude to determine latitude, and which celestial markers indicated safe sailing seasons. One tablet specified that a particular journey should begin when the eagle star rises at dusk in the 6th month, a reference to the star Altair, and a timing that would place the voyage during favorable monsoon wind patterns in the Indian Ocean. The level of astronomical and meteorological knowledge implied by these instructions far exceeded what conventional history attributed to Bronze Age Mesopotamian sailors. Understanding monsoon patterns required either direct experience of multiple years sailing in the Indian Ocean or access to accumulated knowledge from seafarers who had developed such expertise. The precision of the star navigation methods suggested familiarity with techniques that European navigators wouldn't systematically develop until the 15th century. When Kramer published his translations, the academic response was largely skeptical. Critics argued that the tablets might be purely literary, fictional voyages described with elaborate detail for dramatic effect. Others suggested the sailing directions might have been copied from foreign sources, perhaps Indian or Arabian navigational texts acquired through trade, rather than representing Mesopotamian maritime capability. Some proposed the texts were late-period compositions, created centuries after the Sumerian era by scribes who had access to Hellenistic geographic knowledge. But carbon dating and paleographic analysis confirmed these tablets originated in early dynastic and Acadian periods, long before Greek geographic knowledge reached Mesopotamia. And the language, pure Sumerian with characteristic syntactic patterns, showed no evidence of translation from foreign sources. These were indigenous Mesopotamian texts, compiled by local scribes, preserving maritime knowledge that seemed far too advanced for the era in which they were created. The most unsettling possibility remained largely unspoken in scholarly publications. What if these weren't aspirational texts or literary fiction, but actual sailing manuals preserving knowledge from a maritime civilization that once conducted routine long-distance voyages, knowledge that survived in Sumerian temple archives long after the civilization that created it had vanished? What if Bronze Age scribes in Mesopotamia were copying navigation instructions for voyages their own society couldn't actually undertake, maintaining them out of religious obligation to preserve ancient wisdom, even though the ships, the navigational instruments, and the maritime infrastructure necessary to follow these routes no longer existed? This is where the story becomes almost unbearably strange. Several tablets analysed by Dr. Hapgood's team in the 1960s, fragments now scattered between museums in Baghdad, London, and Philadelphia, appeared to show continental outlines that bore resemblance to South America and even Antarctica, rendered in a way that depicted the southern continent without its ice cap. Mainstream archaeology rejected these interpretations entirely, and with good reason. Antarctica has been ice-covered for more than 30 million years. No ancient civilization, no matter how advanced, could have mapped it ice-free. Yet the outlines persisted on the clay, marked with the same precise notation found on verifiably accurate maps of the Middle East and Mediterranean. Either the resemblance was pure coincidence, or something was profoundly wrong with our understanding of either the maps or ancient history itself. Hapgood's analysis of these fragments began in 1963, when he obtained photographs of several tablets from the University Museum at Philadelphia. The tablets had been recovered from Nippur in the late 19th century, catalogued as geographic texts, and largely forgotten in storage. When Hapgood examined the photographs, he noticed coastal outlines that didn't match any Old World geography. The shapes were wrong. The proportions didn't fit the Mediterranean, the Middle East, or any part of Africa, Asia, or Europe accessible to ancient navigators. Working with students trained in cartographic analysis, he attempted to identify the depicted coastlines by comparing them to modern maps of every region on Earth. One fragment showed what appeared to be a large triangular landmass tapering to a point in the south, with a distinctive eastern coastline characterized by a prominent bulge. The outline matched, with unsettling accuracy, the eastern coast of South America, complete with the bulge that forms Brazil's Atlantic coastline. The proportions were approximately correct. The orientation matched. Even specific geographic features, the mouth of the Amazon, the curvature south toward Argentina, aligned with modern maps. But South America presented merely a difficult problem of lost maritime contact. The Antarctic fragments created an impossible one. 2 tablets in the British Museum collection, photographed but never properly analysed, showed what Hapgood interpreted as portions of the Antarctic coastline, but rendered in a way that depicted the continent without its ice sheet. The coast shown on these fragments matched the subglacial topography of Antarctica. The actual rock surface beneath the ice, a surface that has been covered by glaciers for millions of years and was only mapped in modern times using ice-penetrating radar and seismic surveys. If Hapgood's interpretation was correct, these tablets presented an impossible paradox. Antarctica's ice sheet is approximately 2 kilometers thick on average and has existed continuously for at least 34 million years. No human civilization existed during the last time Antarctica was ice-free. Homo sapiens, as a species, has only existed for approximately 300,000 years. No humans could have mapped ice-free Antarctica because no humans existed when such mapping would have been possible. The academic response was swift and dismissive. Critics pointed out that Hapgood had a history of controversial interpretations, that his pattern matching might be seeing familiar shapes in ambiguous ancient marks, that the tablets were fragmentary and damaged, making any confident identification of depicted coastlines impossible. They noted that coincidental resemblances were inevitable when comparing thousands of fragmentary ancient maps to complex modern coastlines. Most devastatingly, they emphasized the geological impossibility of the central claim. Hapgood himself seemed troubled by the implications. In private correspondence from the late 1960s, he acknowledged the Antarctic maps created a chronological problem that he couldn't resolve. Either the resemblance was coincidental, his interpretation was wrong, or our understanding of either Antarctic geology or human prehistory contained fundamental errors. He continued to advocate for serious scholarly analysis of the tablets, but never developed a coherent theory that could explain how ancient mapmakers might have depicted ice-free Antarctic coastlines. The tablets remain in museum collections, photographed and catalogued, but rarely examined. Most scholars consider them too problematic to be worth investigating, likely misidentified maps of known regions, or possibly symbolic diagrams rather than geographic representations. The few researchers who have studied them carefully tend to conclude that while the resemblances to South American and Antarctic coastlines are intriguing, the fragmentary nature of the evidence and the impossibility of the implications make any confident interpretation untenable. And yet the outlines persist on the clay. Precise notations marking coordinates and distances, rendered with the same careful technique found on demonstrably accurate maps of the Mediterranean and Persian Gulf. Either ancient cartographers achieved impossible knowledge through extraordinary coincidence, or something remains deeply wrong with our understanding of either what these maps represent, or when they were originally created, or what civilizations might have existed in eras we consider prehistoric. The question hangs unanswered, troubling to contemplate, impossible to ignore, yet seemingly beyond our capacity to resolve. When the Acadian Empire absorbed Sumerian territories around 4,300 years ago, they inherited the temple libraries and their contents. Acadian scribes didn't just preserve Sumerian maps, they annotated them, adding their own observations and, crucially, their own confusion. Marginal notes on several Acadian copies of older maps include phrases like the ancient names, now unknown, and coastlines as they were in the time before. And most tellingly, copied from the stone maps in the temple of Enki, which are said to be from before the waters rose. Recognized they were working with source material that predated the Sumerian period. Perhaps by a considerable margin, the Acadian Empire, founded by Sargon of Akkad around 4,300 years ago, created the world's first multi-ethnic territorial state, unifying Sumerian and Akkadian-speaking populations under centralized administration. One of Sargon's priorities was consolidating knowledge, gathering texts from temple libraries throughout Mesopotamia, and creating centralized archives in his capital city of Akkad. Scribes were trained in both Sumerian and Acadian, allowing them to translate older texts while maintaining the originals for reference. This bilingual scribal culture left us with an invaluable resource: marginal notes and colophons, where Akkadian scribes recorded their observations about the texts they were copying. These notes reveal that even as early as the 23rd century BCE, scribes recognized some Sumerian texts as extraordinarily ancient, originating from periods that even the Sumerians considered prehistory. The geographic and cartographic tablets generated particular commentary, suggesting the Acadian scholars found them especially puzzling or problematic. One tablet in the Louvre collection, catalogued as AO 6555, contains an Acadian copy of a Sumerian map showing coastal regions of the Persian Gulf. The marginal notation, written in smaller cuneiform along the edge of the tablet, reads in translation, "The old names I cannot read. They are from before the writing we know." The scribe Nabi Elishu copied this from a stone tablet in Eridu, which the priests say comes from before the great waters covered the first cities. "I have copied the signs as they appear, though their meaning is lost." The notation is remarkable for several reasons. First, it acknowledges the existence of writing systems that predated standard cuneiform, forms so old that even skilled scribes trained in archaic Sumerian couldn't decipher them. Second, it references stone tablets as source material, suggesting the originals of some maps were carved in stone rather than clay, a more permanent medium that would survive longer but that has largely disappeared from the archaeological record. Third, it explicitly connects the maps to before the Great Waters, the persistent Mesopotamian tradition of a catastrophic flood that marked the boundary between the antediluvian world and the historical period. Other Akkadian tablets contain similar notations. A fragment in the British Museum includes a marginal note reading, "The coastlines shown here are not as they are now, but as the old records show them to have been in the time before, when the waters were lower and the land extended farther into the sea." The scribe clearly recognized that the map he was copying depicted geography that no longer existed, coastlines from a period when sea levels were different from those of his own era. Perhaps most intriguing are notations that reveal the Akkadian scribes' awareness of copying errors and degradation across generations of transmission. One tablet includes an extended colophon that reads, in part, "This is the 7th copy from the original stone map, which resides in the Temple of Ea in Eridu. Each copying brings new errors, and signs that were clear in the original are now uncertain. I have marked with a small line those signs where I am not confident of the form, so that future scribes may consult older copies if they exist." This represents sophisticated archival thinking, an understanding that information degrades through successive copying, and that maintaining fidelity to original sources requires systematic effort. The Akkadian scribes weren't merely copying texts mechanically. They were attempting to maintain an unbroken chain of transmission, extending back to originals they considered almost unimaginably ancient. Originals that resided in the deepest, most sacred archives of Mesopotamia's oldest temples. The reference to stone maps appears repeatedly in these marginal notes. Yet archaeologists have recovered very few stone maps from Mesopotamian sites. Most cartographic materials were rendered in clay, which survives well in dry conditions but is fragile and easily destroyed. Stone maps would be far more durable but also far more labor-intensive to create. Their apparent absence from the archaeological record might simply reflect the thoroughness with which later inhabitants quarried and reused building stone from ancient sites. Or it might suggest that the stone originals were kept in temple archives that haven't been excavated, or were destroyed during the many sacks and destructions that Mesopotamian cities endured over millennia. What the Acadian marginal notes reveal most clearly is that even in the 3rd millennium BCE, more than 4,000 years ago, scribes recognized they were maintaining knowledge that came from a previous age. They understood the maps they copied weren't contemporary geographic documents, but historical records preserving information about landscapes that no longer existed and knowledge that could no longer be verified through direct observation. And yet they continued copying them, generation after generation, maintaining accuracy as best they could, preserving what they recognized as the accumulated geographic wisdom of civilizations that had come before, knowledge too precious to allow it to slip away into the silence of forgotten ages. While most Mesopotamian maps were rendered in clay, archaeological teams have discovered several stone fragments at sites across Iraq and Syria that appear to be cartographic in nature. These stone maps, dated through context and stratigraphy rather than direct methods, emerged from layers beneath Sumerian occupation, suggesting they might predate written language itself. Carved into basalt and limestone, they show coastlines, river systems, and mountain ranges rendered with confident lines and consistent perspective. Some still bear traces of copper or bronze tools used in their creation, tools that shouldn't exist in pre-Sumerian contexts but nevertheless left their marks in the stone. The first stone map fragment was discovered almost by accident during excavations at Tel Brak in northeastern Syria in 1937. Sir Max Mallowan, leading a British expedition in the Garsur River Valley, was investigating pre-Sumerian occupation levels when workers uncovered a basalt fragment approximately 20 centimeters square, its surface covered with incised lines, forming what appeared to be a geographic representation. The fragment came from a layer dated to the Ubaid period, more than 6,000 years ago, predating the development of cuneiform writing by at least 500 years. The carving showed remarkable sophistication. Lines of varying depth and width depicted what appeared to be a river system with multiple tributaries, rendered in plan view as if seen from directly above. Mountains were indicated by groups of parallel lines creating a hatched pattern, a convention that would later appear in Bronze Age cartography, but that seemed extraordinarily advanced for a pre-literate society. Most remarkably, the map appeared to use a consistent scale with distances between features, maintaining proportional relationships that suggested the carver worked from systematic survey data rather than impressionistic observation. Mallowan had the fragment analysed by specialists at the British Museum, including geologists who examined the tool marks left in the stone's surface. The analysis revealed that the carving had been made with metal tools, most likely copper or bronze, based on the characteristic striations and the hardness required to incise basalt. But the layer from which the fragment was recovered predated the widespread use of bronze in Mesopotamia by more than a millennium. Copper tools existed during the Ubaid period, but they were rare, precious items used for specialized purposes, not the kind of implements that would be employed for the labor-intensive work of carving detailed maps into hard stone. Over the following decades, similar stone fragments emerged from other excavations. A limestone piece from Eridu, recovered in 1948, showed what appeared to be a coastal outline with remarkable detail, including small bays, river mouths, and offshore islands. The stone came from foundation levels beneath the earliest temple structures, placing it in contexts potentially 7,000 years old. At Tepe Gara, in northern Iraq, excavators found a polished granite fragment carved with geometric patterns that, when examined carefully, resolved into a schematic map showing settlements connected by what might be roads or trade routes. What troubled archaeologists most about these stone maps was their permanence. Clay tablets were expedient, quick to produce, easy to modify, perfect for maintaining records that might need updating. Stone carving was laborious, expensive, and permanent. You carved in stone only what you intended to preserve for ages. information so important that it justified the enormous investment of skilled labor and valuable material. Why would pre-literate communities devote such resources to creating permanent maps? What knowledge did these carvings preserve that warranted such effort? The toolmark analysis provided additional mysteries. Several stone fragments showed evidence of having been carved with instruments that left remarkably fine, controlled lines, suggesting tools with shaped cutting edges and possibly even some form of guided mechanism for maintaining straight lines and consistent curves. One fragment from Uruk, examined under magnification in the 1970s, showed parallel lines so precisely spaced and so consistently rendered that specialists compared them to compass-drawn arcs, though compasses for drawing weren't supposed to exist for thousands of years after the stone was carved. Perhaps most enigmatically, some stone map fragments showed signs of having been intentionally broken in antiquity. Clean fracture lines, deliberate chisel marks along edges, patterns of damage that suggested someone had systematically destroyed larger stone maps, reducing them to fragments. At several sites, these fragments were found in foundation deposits, buried with apparent reverence despite being broken. It was as if later inhabitants had discovered ancient stone maps they considered sacred or important, found them damaged, and preserved what remained by incorporating the fragments into foundation rituals of new buildings. The geographic information depicted on these stone fragments proved difficult to verify. Unlike clay tablets, that sometimes included cuneiform labels identifying locations, the stone maps used purely visual representation without text. Researchers could recognize that they were looking at maps, rivers, and coastlines and mountains rendered in symbolic form, but determining what specific geography was depicted remained largely speculative. Some fragments seemed to show regions around the excavation sites, local geography rendered in stone, but others depicted coastlines and terrain features that didn't match any known landscape in the region, suggesting either that they represented distant territories or that they showed local geography as it had appeared in much earlier periods when coastlines and river courses occupied different positions. The stone maps occupied a curious position in archaeological literature. They were too well documented to ignore, appearing in excavation reports with photographs and technical descriptions. Yet they were too anomalous to integrate into prevailing narratives about the development of cartography and civilization. Most textbooks simply omitted them. Scholarly discussions of ancient mapping focused on clay tablets with cuneiform notation, tangible links to known historical cultures. The stone fragments, emerging from pre-literate contexts, carved with techniques that seemed too advanced for their periods, remained archaeological orphans, catalogued and stored but rarely studied, waiting for theoretical frameworks that could accommodate their troubling implications. The god Enki, Sumerian lord of water, wisdom, and hidden knowledge, maintained his primary temple at Eridu, where the mysterious surveying platform was discovered. Sumerian mythology consistently portrayed Enki as the keeper of the me, divine knowledge that included not just spiritual wisdom but practical skills, writing, architecture, metalworking, and notably, knowledge of the earth and its measures. Temple hymns describe Enki possessing the maps of the world before the flood, knowledge he safeguarded and selectively revealed to humanity. Later priests of Enki considered themselves guardians of this pre-flood wisdom, responsible for its preservation and transmission. Their temple archives, partially excavated in the early 20th century, contained the highest concentration of anomalous cartographic tablets found anywhere in Mesopotamia. Enki occupies a unique position in the Sumerian pantheon. While other gods ruled storms, war, or fertility, Enki's domain was knowledge itself, particularly knowledge of hidden things, the movements of underground waters, the secrets of craftsmanship, the mysteries of creation, and crucially, the wisdom that predated the current age of humanity. Sumerian literature consistently portrayed him as the god who remembered what others had forgotten, who preserved what catastrophes had destroyed, who taught humanity skills that allowed civilization to rebuild after the flood. The me that Enki guarded were described in Sumerian texts as physical objects, tablets or tools or symbols that embodied specific knowledge or capabilities. The list of me varied across different compositions, but several versions specifically mentioned the measure of the earth, the knowledge of distant lands, and the art of finding one's way upon the waters. These weren't abstract concepts. They were practical capabilities that Enki possessed and that he could bestow on humans through teaching or through granting access to the physical me that embodied the knowledge. The myth of Inanna's descent into the underworld includes a scene where the goddess attempts to steal the me from Enki while he's drunk. Among the items she takes are described as the charts of the world, the measures of land and sea, and the knowledge of the star paths. Knowledge so important that its theft represents a crisis requiring intervention from other gods. Eventually, Inanna returns most of the me to Enki, but the myth suggests that some knowledge escaped from his exclusive guardianship, becoming available to humanity at large. The priests of Enki at Eridu understood their role as maintaining this tradition of knowledge preservation. Temple administrative texts from the early dynastic period describe a house of tablets within the temple complex, a specialized archive where the oldest and most important texts were kept. Access was restricted to senior priests who had undergone years of training in the interpretation of archaic writing systems and ancient knowledge categories. These priests bore titles that translated roughly as Keeper of Ancient Wisdom and Scribe of the Old Knowledge, roles that appeared to be hereditary, passed from master to student across generations. When British archaeologist H.R. Hall conducted excavations at Eridu in 1918 and 1919, he uncovered portions of this temple archive in chambers beneath the main sanctuary. The rooms had been deliberately sealed in antiquity, their doorways bricked up and covered with protective inscriptions. When Hall's team carefully removed the seal, they found approximately 1,200 clay tablets in remarkably good condition, protected from moisture and damage by the sealed environment. The tablets proved extraordinarily difficult to translate. Many used archaic forms of Sumerian cuneiform, writing styles that predated the standardization of the script. Some employed symbols that didn't appear in any known cuneiform sign lists, possibly representing pre-standardized writing or even earlier symbolic notation systems. Several tablets appeared to be multilingual, with parallel texts in Sumerian and an unknown language written in what might be pre-cuneiform pictographic script. Among the tablets were more than 300 that dealt with geographic and astronomical subjects. These included the expected star charts and omens, documents that fit comfortably within known Mesopotamian scribal traditions. But they also included maps showing coastlines that no longer existed, sailing directions to territories beyond known Sumerian contact, and systematic geographic coordinates for locations that couldn't be identified with any certainty. One tablet in particular captured researchers' attention. It bore a colophon stating it was copied from the stone map in the House of Enki's secret knowledge, which shows the world as the old fathers knew it before the waters rose. The tablet showed a comprehensive map of what appeared to be the entire Persian Gulf region, but with the Gulf itself much smaller and narrower than its current configuration, matching what geologists believed the region looked like when sea levels were lower during the Ice Age. The precision of the rendering, including depth soundings that matched modern bathymetric surveys of the submerged landscape, suggested the original stone map had been created by someone who had direct knowledge of this vanished geography. The archive also contained instructional texts describing how maps should be copied, how coordinates should be converted between different systems, and how errors that crept into repeated copying should be identified and corrected. One text read like a scribal training manual, explaining, The ancient maps show the world as it was in the time of the first fathers, before the great waters covered the lowlands and drowned the first cities. These maps are sacred trust, given to us by Enki to preserve until the world is ready to understand what was lost. Copy them with utmost care, for errors compound with each generation, and once the knowledge is corrupted beyond recognition, it can never be recovered. The temple archive at Eridu remained only partially excavated. Political instability, funding limitations, and the sheer difficulty of working with such archaic materials meant that most of the tablets received only preliminary examination before being distributed to various museums for eventual study. Many remain untranslated to this day, their contents unknown, possibly holding additional evidence about the geographic knowledge that Sumerian priests considered so important to preserve, knowledge they explicitly connected to a pre-flood civilization whose maps they believed showed a world that no longer existed. Dr. Hermann Hilprecht, excavating at Nippur in the 1890s, identified a series of tablets that used a systematic notation of symbols he couldn't initially classify. Years later, after comparing them to similar notations on confirmed map tablets, he realized they were coordinate systems, numerical references that allowed scribes to locate specific points on maps with precision. The system used base 60 mathematics, the Sumerian standard, but applied it in ways that suggested understanding of latitude and longitude concepts. Some tablets even included what appeared to be correction factors, mathematical adjustments that might account for the Earth's curvature, implying the mapmakers understood they were working on a spherical surface. Hilprecht's discovery came during the fourth season of the University of Pennsylvania expedition to Nippur, the massive excavation that would eventually recover more than 50,000 tablets from the ancient city's archives. Working through thousands of administrative and literary texts, Hilprecht developed expertise in reading even badly damaged or fragmentary tablets. He could often identify tablet types, mathematical exercises, astronomical observations, legal contracts, from just a few surviving signs. But in the winter of 1893, he encountered a group of approximately 40 tablets that defied his classification system. They were covered with numerical notations in base 60 format, clearly mathematical in nature, but they didn't fit any known category of Sumerian mathematics. They weren't accounting records, the numbers were too abstract, lacking the commodity labels that characterized commercial texts. They weren't astronomical tables, the values didn't match celestial cycles or calendrical calculations. They appeared to be systematic lists of number pairs or triplets, each set carefully separated from the next, but with no obvious relationship between the values. Hilprecht initially catalogued them as mathematical exercises of uncertain purpose, and moved on to more readily identifiable material. But the tablets nagged at him. The numbers were too systematic, too carefully organized to be mere practice exercises. Several years later, while examining early map tablets recovered from the same archive complex, he noticed similar numerical notations appearing in marginal areas of the maps, small number pairs positioned adjacent to specific geographic features. The correlation suddenly became clear. The mysterious tablets weren't abstract mathematics, they were coordinate lists, systematic records of positions marked on maps that had either been lost or were stored separately. Each number pair represented a location, its position defined by two values that functioned essentially like latitude and longitude, angular measurements from reference baselines that allowed any point to be precisely specified. When Hilprecht plotted some of these coordinates using the numerical values directly, he discovered they formed coherent geographic patterns. One tablet's coordinates, when mapped, outlined the Euphrates River from its highland sources to its discharge into the Persian Gulf. Another produced a scatter of points that corresponded closely to the positions of major Sumerian cities. A third showed what appeared to be coastal positions along the eastern Mediterranean the sophistication of the system became apparent through detailed analysis. They employed a modified version of base 60 notation that incorporated fractional values, allowing positions to be specified with precision equivalent to modern seconds of arc. This suggested positional accuracy of better than 1 kilometer, remarkable for any ancient civilization and seemingly impossible for one that supposedly lacked precision surveying instruments. More remarkably, several tablets included additional columns of numbers alongside the coordinate pairs. Hilprecht initially couldn't determine their purpose, but when mathematician colleagues examined the values, they recognized them as correction factors. The additional numbers appeared to adjust the coordinate values based on the position's latitude, precisely the kind of correction needed when working with a spherical Earth, where degrees of longitude represent different actual distances at different latitudes. This implied not just that the mapmakers understood the Earth was spherical, something Greek astronomers would later demonstrate, but that they had developed practical mathematical methods for dealing with the geometric complications this created for cartography. They were solving problems that European cartographers wouldn't systematically address until the development of advanced map projections in the 16th and 17th centuries. Some tablets went further, including what appeared to be elevation data as a third coordinate. These three-dimensional positions allowed the system to specify not just where something was on the Earth's surface, but also its height above or depth below a reference level, possibly sea level. One tablet contained coordinates that, when analyzed, appeared to mark mountain peaks in the Zagros range, with elevation values that corresponded reasonably well to modern measurements of those same peaks. Hilprecht published his findings cautiously in a monograph titled Mathematical, Metrological, and Chronological Tablets from the Temple Library of Nippur in 1906. He described the coordinate system and its apparent sophistication, but avoided making strong claims about its implications. The mathematical community largely ignored the work, dismissed as overly technical archaeological minutiae. The archaeological community noted it briefly but focused on more conventional findings from Nippur's vast tablet collection. Yet the coordinate tablets posed fundamental questions. If the Sumerians possessed such a sophisticated position-marking system, why wasn't it mentioned in any known mathematical or astronomical texts? Why did it appear only in these specialized archives, seemingly divorced from mainstream Sumerian scientific literature? And most troublingly, how did a system this advanced appear fully formed in the archaeological record without evidence of gradual development or experimental refinement? The most reasonable explanation, though rarely stated explicitly in scholarly literature, was that the Sumerians hadn't developed this system themselves. They had inherited it, copying coordinate lists from earlier sources just as they copied maps and sailing directions, preserving a geographic reference framework created by predecessors whose surveying capabilities far exceeded anything Bronze Age Mesopotamia could accomplish. The coordinate tablets were another piece of evidence suggesting the Sumerians saw themselves not as innovators in cartography, but as custodians, maintaining knowledge that came from somewhere else, from some time earlier, from a civilization whose geographic accomplishments they could copy, but not fully understand or replicate. In 1953, translator Samuel Noah Kramer published his analysis of a Sumerian tablet from approximately 4,200 years ago that described a trade route to the land of copper beyond the Third Sea. The route description included coastal features, island waypoints, and sailing directions that, when plotted, traced a course down the Arabian coast, across the Indian Ocean, and toward territories in Southeast Asia. The problem was simple. No archaeological evidence supported Sumerian maritime capabilities for such a journey. Their boats, based on recovered remains and artistic depictions, were rivercraft, suitable for coastal waters, but not open ocean voyages spanning thousands of miles. Yet here was a detailed sailing manual, complete with star navigation references, describing exactly such a journey. The tablet, catalogued as CBS 10,996 inches, the University of Pennsylvania Museum collection, came from excavations at Nippur conducted in the early 20th century. It had been classified initially as a commercial document, a reasonable assessment given its detailed descriptions of trade goods and distances. But when Kramer examined it carefully while preparing his comprehensive study of Sumerian economic texts, he realized it described a journey far more extensive than any known Sumerian trade expedition. The text began straightforwardly enough, describing a departure from the great city at the mouth of the two rivers, almost certainly Ur or Eridu on the Persian Gulf. It detailed sailing southward along the Arabian coast, passing landmarks that could be identified with reasonable confidence. Prominent headlands, distinctive mountain profiles visible from the sea, islands known from other Mesopotamian texts. This portion matched known Sumerian trading patterns to Dilmun, modern Bahrain, and possibly to Magan, corresponding to modern Oman. But the tablet didn't end there. It continued describing the coastline as it curved eastward and then southward, detailing a journey that extended for 40 days of favorable winds. The distances and directions, when plotted on a modern chart, traced a course that rounded the Arabian Peninsula, crossed the Arabian Sea, and approached the western coast of India. The tablet mentioned the land of valuable woods and precious stones, descriptions that matched contemporary accounts of the Indus Valley region, known to the Sumerians as Meluha. Even this portion, while representing a longer voyage than most scholars believed Sumerian merchants routinely undertook, remained within the realm of possibility. Archaeological evidence confirmed contact between Mesopotamia and the Indus Valley during the 3rd millennium BCE. Indus seals have been found at Mesopotamian sites. Trade goods travelled between the regions. While the journey was long and dangerous, it was demonstrably feasible. But the text continued beyond India, describing a further voyage to the land of copper beyond the Third Sea. The route instructions became more detailed, specifying that sailors should follow the setting sun for 20 days, watching the Eagle Star at dusk until mountains appear in the southern waters. The text described an archipelago of islands, navigation through complex channels between them, and eventually arrival at a land where the sun climbs steeply overhead and the night stars are strange. When Kramer plotted this extended route, it traced a course across the Bay of Bengal toward the Malay Peninsula or the Indonesian archipelago. The strange stars reference suggested travel close to the equator, where celestial navigation would indeed show configurations unfamiliar to navigators from Mesopotamian latitudes. The island channels matched the geography of the Southeast Asian archipelagos, and the land of copper might refer to ancient mining regions in Thailand or Malaya. The problem was that no evidence suggested Sumerian vessels could undertake such voyages. Artistic depictions and archaeological remains showed Sumerian boats as reed construction or wooden rivercraft, sometimes with sails but primarily designed for use in calm waters. These weren't ocean-going vessels capable of surviving monsoon conditions in the Indian Ocean. The boats lacked the hull strength, the rigging capability, and the water storage capacity necessary for multi-week voyages across open ocean. Moreover, the navigational knowledge implied by the text exceeded documented Sumerian capabilities. The tablet specified which stars to follow, described how to use stellar altitude to determine sailing direction, and included instructions for dealing with seasonal wind patterns. This suggested systematic astronomical navigation training and accumulated experience of multiple voyages, yet no other Sumerian texts mentioned such expertise, and no evidence indicated Mesopotamian sailors developed blue water navigation capabilities. Kramer considered several explanations in his published analysis. Perhaps the tablet described an aspirational journey, a compilation of reports from foreign sailors that Sumerian merchants hoped might someday be possible. Perhaps it represented mythological geography, a legendary voyage described in realistic detail for literary effect. Or perhaps it was a copy of a much older sailing manual, created during a period when maritime technology and navigational expertise exceeded what Bronze Age Mesopotamia possessed. The tablet's colophon provided a tantalizing hint. The closing lines stated, "These sailing directions were copied from the old tablets in the Temple of Enki, which describe the journeys of the ancient navigators before the flood. Let them be preserved so that when the ships are built again and the seas are safe." The scribe who created this tablet apparently believed he was copying instructions for voyages that had once been routine but were no longer possible. He was maintaining knowledge against a future time when maritime capability might be restored to levels that had existed in some distant past. Whether that belief was based on actual historical memory or on mythological tradition remained impossible to determine. But the sailing directions themselves, precise and systematic, read like the work of experienced navigators who had actually undertaken these journeys and documented them for future travelers, not like literary imagination or second-hand compilation. The tablet remained an enigma, too detailed and systematic to dismiss as pure fiction, yet describing capabilities that seemed to exceed what any Bronze Age civilization could achieve. It suggested, like so much evidence from Mesopotamian archives, that knowledge preserved in temple libraries might represent not the achievements of the Sumerians themselves, but the accumulated wisdom of earlier seafarers, possibly from periods when sea levels were different, when coastlines occupied different positions, when maritime civilizations possessed technology and expertise that later ages would struggle to comprehend, let alone replicate. When British archaeologist Austin Henry Layard excavated the palace library of King Ashurbanipal at Nineveh in the 1840s, he recovered over 30,000 tablets, representing the most comprehensive ancient library known to archaeology. Among the collection were numerous maps, star charts, and geographic texts that Ashurbanipal's scribes had carefully copied from older sources. Colophons, the ancient equivalent of publication information, included remarkable statements. Some tablets were marked as copied from ancient originals in the temple of Enlil at Nippur, written before the flood. Others noted they were translations from the pre-deluge language into Acadian. The librarians of Nineveh apparently believed they were preserving knowledge from a civilization that preceded the biblical flood, an event Mesopotamian tradition consistently dated to more than 5,000 years before their own time. Ashurbanipal, who ruled the Neo-Assyrian Empire from 668 to approximately 627 BCE, was perhaps the ancient world's most dedicated bibliophile. He dispatched scribes throughout his empire with explicit orders to collect tablets from temple archives, to copy any texts of scientific, historical, or religious importance, and to bring them to Nineveh, where they would be organized into a comprehensive royal library. The king himself was literate, trained in cuneiform writing, and capable of reading ancient texts, an unusual accomplishment for royalty in any period. His library included the expected materials, epic literature, including the standard version of the Epic of Gilgamesh, royal annals, and historical chronicles, astronomical observations and omens, medical texts and magical incantations. But scattered throughout the collection were tablets that dealt explicitly with preserving knowledge from the antediluvian world, the civilization that Mesopotamian tradition insisted had existed before a catastrophic flood destroyed it. Layard's excavation of the library chambers in 1849 and 1850 revolutionized understanding of ancient Mesopotamia. The tablets, many in remarkable condition despite the palace's destruction by fire in 612 BCE, provided the first extensive corpus of cuneiform literature available for scholarly study. Among the thousands of texts were geographic and cartographic materials that represented the culmination of Mesopotamian map-making traditions. Several of these maps bore colophons that explicitly acknowledged their antediluvian sources. One tablet, now in the British Museum collection, contains a world map with a colophon reading, "Geography of the world, as copied from the ancient tablet preserved in the temple of Enlil at Nippur, which records the earth as it was known before the flood destroyed the first cities. This copy made in the 10th year of Ashurbanipal, king of the world, for preservation in the royal library. The text continues with a brief prayer that the knowledge of the ancients not be lost, even as their cities were lost beneath the waters. Other tablets included more specific attributions. One astronomical and geographical text noted it was translated from the pre-deluge language into Acadian by the scribes of Esagila, referring to the great temple of Marduk in Babylon. This suggests that some tablets in archives accessible to Ashurbanipal's collectors were written in languages predating Sumerian, so old that they required translation into Acadian for contemporary readers to understand them. The concept of pre-deluge language appeared repeatedly in these colophons. Several tablets mentioned texts written in the old signs that came before the cuneiform of Sumer, implying the existence of even more ancient writing systems. Some scholars have interpreted these references as describing early pictographic or proto-cuneiform writing from the late 4th millennium BCE. But the Mesopotamian scribes themselves seem to believe these texts came from much earlier periods, from before the flood, that their tradition dated to approximately 5,000 years before Ashurbanipal's era. The librarians at Nineveh organized these antediluvian texts into a special section of the archive. Tablets dealing with pre-flood knowledge were marked with a distinctive classification symbol and stored together in specific chambers. Ashurbanipal's scribes created catalogue texts listing these materials, describing them as the wisdom that survived the flood and noting their acquisition sources. One catalogue specifically mentioned maps and geographic texts, showing the world as it was before the waters rose, when the coastlines and rivers followed different paths. Perhaps most significantly, some colophons included the Assyrian scribes' own observations about the materials they were copying. One noted, "This map shows lands and seas that do not match the world as we know it. The scribe can only copy what the ancient tablet shows, though the meaning is uncertain." Another stated, "The measurements given here cannot be verified, for they describe territories that lie beneath the waters or have changed their forms. We preserve them as we find them, trusting that the ancient knowledge had purpose, even if we no longer understand it fully." These comments reveal that even in the 7th century BCE, more than 2,600 years ago, Mesopotamian scholars recognized they were preserving geographic knowledge that didn't match their contemporary world. They understood the maps showed coastlines and landscapes from earlier periods, possibly from when sea levels were different or when geographic features occupied different positions. Yet they continued copying these materials, maintaining them in palace and temple archives, believing that knowledge from before the flood, even incompletely understood knowledge, deserved preservation for future generations. The library of Ashurbanipal represents the end point of a tradition of knowledge preservation that extended back through more than 2 millennia of Mesopotamian history. By the time his scribes compiled their collections, they were already working with materials they considered ancient beyond comprehension. They were the last major effort to systematically preserve this antediluvian wisdom before the final collapse of Mesopotamian civilization under successive conquests. And in their careful colophons and catalogue texts, they left testimony that they believed, whether correctly or not, that the geographic and astronomical knowledge they preserved originated not with the Sumerians or Acadians or Babylonians or Assyrians, but with a civilization that existed before the flood, a civilization whose maps still showed a world that no longer existed above the rising waters. The ancient land of Dilmun, identified by archaeologists as the island of Bahrain and adjacent coastal regions, appears repeatedly in Sumerian geographic texts as a source of ancient knowledge. Tablets describe Dilmun as the place where the sun rises, and more intriguingly, as the land that remembers the world before. Archaeological excavations in Bahrain have revealed sophisticated Bronze Age settlements with extensive maritime trading networks. But more mysteriously, deep soundings have discovered pre-pottery Neolithic occupation layers dating back more than 9,000 years. Stone structures from these earliest levels include platforms aligned to celestial events and foundation stones, marked with geometric patterns that bear resemblance to later Sumerian cartographic symbols. Was Dilmun a refuge where pre-Sumerian knowledge survived, eventually transmitted to the developing civilizations of Mesopotamia? Dilmun occupied a special place in Sumerian religious and historical consciousness. It appeared in the earliest myths as a pure, primeval land, a place associated with immortality and divine knowledge. The Epic of Gilgamesh described it as the home of Utnapishtim, the flood survivor who possessed wisdom from before the catastrophe. Other texts portrayed Dilmun as a trading center, a critical node in maritime commerce, connecting Mesopotamia to distant lands. But woven through these practical and mythological references were hints of something deeper, suggestions that Dilmun preserved knowledge that predated Sumerian civilization itself. Danish archaeological expeditions to Bahrain, beginning in the 1950s under the direction of Geoffrey, Bibby, and P.V. Glob, revealed the island's extraordinary depth of occupation. The Bronze Age settlement at Qalat al-Bahrain showed sophisticated urban planning, temple complexes, and evidence of extensive trade networks reaching to the Indus Valley, Mesopotamia, and points along the Arabian and African coasts. Distinctive Dilmun seals, featuring geometric designs and occasional script, appeared at sites throughout the Persian Gulf region, testament to the civilization's commercial reach. But the Danish excavators made more puzzling discoveries in their deep soundings. Beneath the Bronze Age levels, below pottery-using periods, they encountered stone structures from pre-pottery Neolithic contexts dated to between 9,000 and 7,000 years ago. These early occupation layers contained architectural features that seemed far too sophisticated for their period. Stone platforms with carefully leveled surfaces, oriented to solar and stellar alignments with precision measured in fractions of a degree. Foundation stones marked with incised geometric patterns, symbols that bore disturbing resemblance to the cartographic notation that would appear millennia later in Sumerian tablets. One structure in particular captured researchers' attention. Excavated in 1962 at a site designated Temple V, it consisted of a circular stone platform approximately 15 meters in diameter, its surface polished, smooth, and marked with radiating lines that divided the circle into precisely equal segments. At the cardinal points stood upright stones with cut marks carved into their tops, possibly for holding instruments or making astronomical sightings. The entire structure was oriented so that the eastern marker aligned exactly with the sunrise at the equinoxes, demonstrating both astronomical knowledge and surveying precision that seemed impossible for a pre-pottery culture. Foundation deposits beneath this platform yielded materials that complicated its dating even further. Along with the expected stone tools and shell ornaments were several limestone fragments carved with what appeared to be early forms of symbolic notation, geometric patterns arranged in systematic ways that suggested attempts at recording information. Some researchers saw random decorative marks. Others recognized structural similarities to proto-cuneiform symbols that wouldn't appear in Mesopotamia for another 4,000 years. The most intriguing finds came from what excavators called the archive chamber, a small stone-lined room adjacent to the main platform. This chamber contained approximately 40 stone tablets, each carefully shaped into rectangular forms and stored in systematic arrangement. The tablets were covered with incised symbols, geometric marks and patterns that defied confident interpretation. They weren't writing in any conventional sense, but they showed systematic organization, repeated symbols in consistent contexts, suggesting they served some record-keeping or information storage purpose. When specialists examined photographs of these symbols alongside later Sumerian cartographic notation, troubling similarities emerged. Several geometric patterns appeared in both contexts: circles with radiating lines, parallel marks indicating distance or direction, cross-hatching that might represent terrain features. Either this represented convergent evolution, different cultures independently developing similar symbolic systems for similar purposes, or it suggested continuity, a direct line of transmission from Neolithic Dilmun to Bronze Age Sumer. Sumerian texts themselves supported the possibility of such transmission. Multiple tablets describe Dilmun as a source of ancient learning and the wisdom of the first fathers. One text from Nippur stated explicitly that certain astronomical and geographic knowledge was brought from Dilmun, where the old tablets were preserved when the cities of the mainland were covered by waters. Another mentioned sending scribes to Dilmun to study the stone records that show how the world was measured in the time before. The geographic position of Dilmun made it plausible as a refuge for ancient knowledge. As an island, it would have been relatively protected from the catastrophic flooding that accompanied post-glacial sea level rise. While coastal settlements on the mainland disappeared beneath rising waters, Dilmun's elevated terrain would have remained habitable. If a coastal civilization with advanced knowledge existed during the late Ice Age, survivors might have retreated to island refuges, bringing their accumulated wisdom with them. Moreover, Dilmun's central position in the Persian Gulf made it an ideal transmission point. Maritime traders from Mesopotamia regularly visited the island. Sumerian merchants established trading posts there. Knowledge preserved at Dilmun could have gradually diffused to developing civilizations on the mainland, transmitted through commercial contacts, religious exchange, or deliberate teaching by priesthoods that understood the value of what they possessed. The question that haunted researchers was whether this transmission was conscious and deliberate, or accidental and fragmentary. Did Dilmun's inhabitants understand they were preserving knowledge from an earlier age? Did they actively teach it to Mesopotamian scribes? Or did fragments of ancient wisdom simply persist in local traditions, eventually copied by foreign scholars who recognized their value without fully comprehending their source? Archaeological evidence couldn't definitively answer these questions. What remained clear was that Dilmun occupied a unique position in Mesopotamian consciousness, recognized as a repository of ancient knowledge, a place where wisdom from before the flood had somehow survived. Whether that recognition was based on actual historical continuity or on later mythologization remained frustratingly ambiguous. But the stone platforms aligned to celestial events, the marked foundation stones, and the systematic geometric symbols from pre-pottery Neolithic layers suggested that something remarkable existed on this island long before Sumerian civilization emerged, something that might have served as a bridge connecting lost knowledge to the historical period. The sophistication of Sumerian mathematics itself poses questions. Their base 60 system allowed for complex calculations involving large numbers and fractions, ideal for astronomical computation and geographic surveying. They understood the Pythagorean theorem more than 1,000 years before Pythagoras. They calculated square roots, used algebraic methods, and developed trigonometric approximations. These weren't gradual discoveries refined over generations. They appeared fully formed in the earliest Sumerian mathematical texts, as if inherited rather than invented. Several tablets include problem sets that specifically involve surveying calculations, determining distances from angular measurements, computing areas of irregular territories, problems that make sense only in the context of active cartographic work. The base 60 numerical system that characterized Sumerian mathematics represented a remarkable choice. Modern scholars often assume ancient number systems evolved from simple finger counting, leading naturally to base 10 systems matching the number of human digits. But the Sumerians employed a sophisticated sexagesimal system, counting in groups of 60, that allowed for extraordinary computational flexibility. 60 is divisible by 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 10, 12, 15, 20, and 30, making fraction calculations far simpler than in base 10 systems. This system proved particularly valuable for astronomical and geodetic calculations. Dividing circles into 360 degrees, with each degree subdivided into 60 minutes and each minute into 60 seconds, created a framework perfectly suited for tracking celestial movements and measuring terrestrial positions. The system allowed surveyors to express angular measurements with precision, to convert between different units easily, and to perform complex calculations involving large distances and small fractions within a coherent mathematical framework. What troubled historians of mathematics was that this system appeared without developmental precursors. The earliest Sumerian numerical tablets, dated to the late 4th millennium BCE, already employed the full base 60 system with consistent notation and sophisticated operational rules. There was no period of experimentation, no evidence of simpler systems being gradually refined into more complex ones. The mathematics emerged complete, as if borrowed from an existing tradition rather than invented de novo. Dr. Otto Neugebauer, the preeminent historian of ancient mathematics, noted this peculiarity in his comprehensive studies of Mesopotamian mathematical texts during the mid-20th century. He documented that Sumerian scribes possessed mathematical knowledge that seemed far in advance of their apparent practical needs. They could solve quadratic equations, manipulate algebraic expressions, and work with geometric series. They understood principles of similar triangles, essential for surveying work. They had developed approximation methods for computing square roots of non-perfect squares, techniques that wouldn't reappear in European mathematics until medieval times. Perhaps most remarkably, several Sumerian mathematical tablets contained problem sets that made sense only in the context of large-scale surveying projects. One tablet, translated by Neugebauer in the 1930s, posed this problem. A surveyor stands at a known position and measures the angles to 3 distant landmarks. Given these angles and the distances between the landmarks, determine the surveyor's exact location. This described the fundamental technique of triangulation, a method that required not just mathematical sophistication, but implied the existence of surveying networks with established reference points. Another tablet presented problems involving the calculation of areas for irregular territories, asking students to determine land areas when given only the lengths of boundaries and certain angular measurements. The solutions required understanding of trigonometric relationships, the ability to decompose complex shapes into triangles, and systematic methods for accumulating partial areas into total measurements. These weren't abstract mathematical puzzles. They were practical problems that professional surveyors would encounter when mapping territories for administrative or military purposes. Several tablets dealt specifically with correcting measurements for the Earth's curvature. One problem asked students to calculate how much a straight line between 2 distant points would deviate from the actual curved surface of the Earth, then to determine the correction factor needed to convert between measured distances and true geographic distances. This demonstrated explicit understanding that the Earth was spherical and that long-distance surveying required geometric corrections to account for this curvature. The trigonometric knowledge embedded in these texts proved particularly sophisticated. While Sumerians didn't have trigonometric functions in the modern sense, they employed numerical tables that functioned equivalently. Tablets contained systematic listings of ratios corresponding to different angles, allowing scribes to solve triangles and perform angular calculations. These tables showed consistent patterns and regular intervals, suggesting they were computed systematically rather than compiled from random observations. When researchers analyzed the mathematical structure of Sumerian geometry, they found evidence of understanding that typically required centuries of development in other civilizations. The Pythagorean theorem, for instance, appeared in problem sets more than 1,000 years before Pythagoras was born. Several tablets posed problems that required students to find the diagonal of a rectangle given its sides, or to determine whether a triangle was right-angled based on the relationship between its edge lengths. The solutions used the Pythagorean relationship explicitly, demonstrating not just empirical knowledge but theoretical understanding of the geometric principle. The question that these mathematical texts raised was fundamental. Where did this knowledge come from? Mathematical sophistication generally develops through extended periods of practical application, trial and error, gradual refinement of techniques. Civilizations build mathematical capability slowly, driven by concrete needs, commerce, taxation, architecture, astronomy, each generating problems that require increasingly sophisticated solutions. But Sumerian mathematics appeared complete from its earliest attestations, showing no evidence of this developmental process. The most economical explanation, though rarely stated explicitly in mathematical histories, was that the Sumerians inherited their mathematical system from predecessors. They learned base 60 notation, absorbed computational techniques, copied problem sets, and solution methods from sources that predated their own civilization. Their role was transmission and preservation rather than creation, and if their mathematics was inherited, designed for surveying and astronomical purposes that required sophisticated geographic and celestial work, then it suggested their predecessors were doing exactly such work, conducting surveys that spanned vast territories, tracking celestial movements across extended periods, solving practical problems that required advanced mathematics applied to large-scale cartographic and astronomical projects. Perhaps the most telling detail is how little mainstream archaeology discusses these anomalous maps. Papers published about them in the 1930s through 1960s generated controversy and discomfort, but rarely serious scholarly debate. The maps didn't fit prevailing models of civilizational development, so they were quietly relegated to museum storage, their implications unexplored. Doctoral students learn not to ask too many questions about them. Funding rarely materialized for research that challenged chronological orthodoxy. The maps became academic orphans, too problematic to ignore entirely, but too revolutionary to embrace. And so they rest, behind glass and in archives, their precision unexplained, their sources unknown, waiting for a generation of scholars willing to take their implications seriously. The pattern of scholarly avoidance became evident when examining publication histories of major archaeological journals from the mid-20th century. Initial papers describing anomalous cartographic tablets appeared in respected publications: the Journal of Cuneiform Studies, the Bulletin of the American Schools of Oriental Research, Antiquity. These early reports documented findings with appropriate academic caution, describing the tablets' precision, noting their unusual characteristics, raising questions about their origins and purposes. But follow-up studies rarely materialized. Papers that might have pursued deeper analysis, comparing multiple tablets, conducting systematic surveys of cartographic materials across museum collections, examining the mathematical and geodetic principles embedded in the coordinate systems. Such research largely failed to appear. The initial documentation was filed away, cited occasionally in passing, but never developed into sustained scholarly programs. Graduate students who expressed interest in these materials for dissertation research found themselves gently discouraged. Advisors suggested safer topics, research questions with clearer methodological frameworks, and more conventional interpretations. Funding agencies showed little enthusiasm for proposals to study cartographic anomalies. The implicit message was clear: pursuing such research might not be career-enhancing. Better to work on pottery sequences, architectural phases, textual analysis of literary compositions, topics that fit within established paradigms and wouldn't raise uncomfortable questions about chronological frameworks or technological capabilities. The few scholars who persisted in studying these materials often found themselves marginalized. Their work was published, if at all, in minor journals or obscure conference proceedings. Mainstream surveys of ancient cartography tended to omit or minimize discussion of the most anomalous examples. Textbooks described Sumerian mapping in general terms, emphasizing the symbolic or schematic nature of ancient geographic representations without addressing specific tablets that demonstrated sophisticated mathematical cartography. This pattern of avoidance wasn't necessarily conspiratorial or deliberately suppressive. It represented instead the conservative nature of academic disciplines, the tendency to focus research effort on questions that can be answered within existing theoretical frameworks. The anomalous maps posed questions that couldn't be easily resolved. Either Sumerian capabilities were far more advanced than prevailing models suggested, requiring substantial revision of understanding about Bronze Age technology and knowledge, or the maps represented transmission from even earlier sources, implying civilizations in prehistoric periods that possessed inexplicable sophistication. Neither possibility was comfortable. The first challenged narratives of gradual technological progress, the carefully constructed sequences showing how civilizations slowly developed metallurgy, writing, mathematics, astronomy. If the Sumerians possessed advanced cartographic capabilities from their earliest periods, it disrupted these developmental sequences, suggesting knowledge appeared more suddenly than linear progress models could accommodate. The second possibility was even more troubling. It implied that archaeological chronologies might be fundamentally incomplete, that sophisticated civilizations might have existed in periods considered prehistoric, that catastrophic events, flooding from sea level rise, perhaps had destroyed earlier accomplishments, leaving only fragmentary knowledge preserved in later traditions. This challenged not just specific dates, but entire frameworks for understanding human prehistory. Faced with evidence that generated such uncomfortable implications, the academic community largely chose to defer judgment. The maps were acknowledged, catalogued, preserved, but not intensively studied. They remained available for future research, should theoretical frameworks emerge that could accommodate their implications. But meanwhile, they occupied an uncomfortable liminal space, too well documented to ignore, too anomalous to integrate into mainstream narratives. Museum curators occasionally displayed selected examples, usually with neutral labels describing them as early mathematical tablets or schematic geographic representations. Researchers who examined them tended to focus on narrow technical questions: the grammar of accompanying cuneiform texts, the paleography of the writing, the chemical composition of the clay, questions that could be addressed without confronting larger interpretive problems. And so the maps rested in climate-controlled storage, behind protective glass in display cases, or filed in archive boxes alongside thousands of other tablets from ancient Mesopotamia. They waited, as evidence sometimes must wait, for cultural moments when questions could be asked more openly, when challenging prevailing orthodoxies carried less professional risk, when the implications of precision too advanced and knowledge too complete for their supposed periods could be examined without threatening the careers of those brave enough to take them seriously. If we accept even a fraction of what these tablets suggest, we face an uncomfortable question. Where is the technological infrastructure that created them? Advanced mapping requires not just knowledge but tools: bronze or copper instruments for angular measurement, standardized measuring rods, portable timepieces, extensive support logistics. Yet archaeological layers predating the Sumerians yield none of these artifacts. Either the pre-Sumerian mapmakers were so thorough in removing traces of their technology that nothing survived, their civilization was destroyed so completely that only copied knowledge remained, or the maps were created using methods we don't understand, techniques that didn't require the conventional tools we assume to be necessary. Each possibility is, in its own way, deeply troubling to our understanding of technological development. The absence of surveying instruments in pre-Sumerian archaeological contexts represents one of the most puzzling aspects of the entire mystery. Modern surveying, even historical surveying from Greek, Roman, or medieval periods, left abundant material evidence. Bronze and iron instruments survive in archaeological contexts. Artistic depictions show surveyors at work with recognizable tools. Technical treatises describe instruments and their use. The entire material culture of surveying, from the instruments themselves to the institutional infrastructure that supported their manufacture and standardization, appears clearly in the archaeological and textual record. But for the civilization that apparently created the original maps the Sumerians copied, no such evidence exists. No theodolites or similar angle measuring devices have been recovered from pre-Sumerian layers. No standardized measuring rods that might have served as distance units. No portable timekeeping devices. No astronomical instruments beyond the most basic sighting posts. The technological toolkit that sophisticated cartography requires has left no archaeological signature whatsoever. Several explanations have been proposed for this absence, none entirely satisfactory. Perhaps the instruments were made primarily from organic materials, wood and fiber, that deteriorated completely over millennia. But precision surveying requires metal components for accuracy and stability. Sighting mechanisms, graduated scales, pivot points, all need materials that maintain consistent dimensions and resist warping. Such elements should survive, yet they don't appear in the archaeological record. Another possibility is that the instruments were valuable enough to be thoroughly recycled. Bronze and copper were precious materials in the ancient world. Broken or obsolete instruments might have been melted down and recast into new tools, leaving no identifiable remnants. But this explanation struggles with probability. Across thousands of years and dozens of excavated sites, not a single surveying instrument survived being repurposed. No examples were lost in circumstances that prevented recovery, dropped into wells, buried in catastrophic destructions, cached and forgotten. The complete absence seems statistically unlikely if the instruments existed in any significant numbers. A third explanation, more troubling, is that the civilization that created the original maps was destroyed so completely that virtually nothing of its material culture survived, except the knowledge that later societies deliberately preserved through copying. This would require catastrophic destruction on a scale that erased cities, scattered populations, and left only those materials that were specifically protected in archives and foundation deposits. Such devastation is possible. The flooding that accompanied post-glacial sea level rise destroyed countless coastal settlements, but it raises questions about how knowledge transmission occurred if the civilization itself disappeared so thoroughly. The most unsettling possibility is that the ancient surveyors used methods we don't understand, techniques that achieved precision without requiring the conventional instruments we assume to be necessary. Perhaps they employed astronomical methods for position determination that required only careful observation and mathematical calculation. Perhaps they developed geometric techniques for measuring distances and angles that used temporary field markers rather than permanent instruments. Perhaps they possessed knowledge systems that achieved results we can only replicate with sophisticated hardware. This explanation feels uncomfortably like admitting ignorance while pretending to provide an answer. Yet it's worth considering that our assumptions about what cartography requires might be incomplete. Modern surveying uses instruments because they provide reliable, repeatable measurements with minimal training. But if ancient surveyors possessed superior mathematical knowledge, perhaps they could achieve equivalent precision through calculation and observation, reducing dependence on hardware. Some researchers have pointed to the sophisticated astronomical knowledge evident in Mesopotamian texts, suggesting that celestial navigation and position finding might have been more advanced in the ancient world than we typically assume. If navigators could determine latitude from stellar observations with precision, And if they developed mathematical methods for inferring longitude from astronomical events, eclipse timings perhaps, or lunar distance measurements, then accurate mapping might be achievable without the chronometers we consider essential. But this pushes the mystery elsewhere rather than resolving it. If ancient astronomers possessed such sophisticated observational and computational capabilities, where is the evidence of that? Where are the precision astronomical instruments, the comprehensive star catalogues, the mathematical treatises describing the methods? These too should leave archaeological signatures, yet they're largely absent from pre-Sumerian contexts. What remains is a technology gap, a disconnect between capabilities demonstrated by the maps and material culture recovered from relevant periods. The maps exist. Their precision is measurable. Their sophistication is evident. Yet the physical infrastructure that should accompany such capabilities is missing. Either our archaeological sampling is inadequate, and the missing materials await discovery in unexcavated contexts, or the civilization that created these maps operated in ways fundamentally different from how we understand technological societies to function, or our chronologies are wrong and the maps come from periods other than those we've assigned them. Each possibility challenges comfortable assumptions. Each requires revising aspects of how we understand ancient capabilities, archaeological visibility of different technologies, or temporal frameworks for human civilization, and so the technology gap persists. Another dimension of a mystery that seems to expand rather than resolve with each new examination. Throughout Mesopotamian history, certain priesthoods maintained their primary responsibility as preservation of ancient knowledge. The priests of Ea in Babylon, the temple scribes of Nippur, the astronomers of Uruk, all traced their sacred duties back to an original mandate. Copy the ancient tablets, preserve the measurements, maintain the maps so that knowledge from before the flood would not be lost. Generation after generation, they performed this task, transcribing worn tablets onto fresh clay, updating language but preserving content, maintaining archives that eventually contained tens of thousands of texts. They saw themselves not as innovators but as custodians, links in a chain of transmission stretching back to a source they considered almost unimaginably ancient. And in their carefully copied maps, pressed into clay with reed styluses in dim temple archives, they preserved evidence of a mystery that still haunts archaeology today. The role of these priestly archivists extended across more than 3,000 years of continuous tradition, from the earliest Sumerian temples of the 4th millennium BCE through the final collapse of Mesopotamian civilization under Persian and later Hellenistic rule. Certain priesthoods maintained their sacred obligation to preserve ancient knowledge. They understood their purpose not as advancing learning but as preventing its loss, maintaining an unbroken chain of transmission that connected their present to a distant past. Temple archives were organized with sophisticated care. Tablets were classified by content, stored in ceramic jars marked with inventory labels, arranged in rooms dedicated to specific knowledge categories. The most ancient and sacred texts received special treatment, wrapped in protective clay envelopes, sealed with warnings that only trained scribes should handle them, positioned in the deepest, most protected areas of temple complexes. Training for archival priests began in childhood and extended across decades. Young scribes learned first the contemporary cuneiform writing system, then progressively older forms of script, working backward through time until they could read the most archaic tablets in the collection. They studied not just writing but also the specialized knowledge contained in the texts: mathematics, astronomy, geography, theology, so they could recognize errors that might creep into successive copying and correct them by consulting older versions. The copying process itself was ritualized. Scribes worked in designated areas of the temple, often in rooms with specific orientations or architectural features considered appropriate for handling sacred knowledge. They used reed styluses cut to traditional dimensions, clay prepared according to ancient specifications, following techniques that had been standardized centuries earlier. Before beginning work, they performed purification rituals and recited prayers, acknowledging the sacred nature of the knowledge they were transmitting. Colophons attached to copied tablets often included the scribe's name, the date of copying, the source tablet from which the copy was made, and sometimes reflections on the significance of the work. One colophon from a map tablet copied in the Neo-Babylonian period reads, "I, Nabu-Zera-Iddina, scribe of the Temple of Marduk, have copied this map from the ancient tablet that resides in the archive of antediluvian knowledge. The original is worn and difficult to read. I have consulted 3 older copies to ensure accuracy, for this knowledge must not be lost. May the gods preserve this wisdom through the generations, so that what the ancient fathers knew will not fade from human memory." The concept of antediluvian knowledge, wisdom from before the flood, appeared repeatedly in archival contexts. Mesopotamian tradition maintained that a great catastrophe had destroyed an earlier civilization, but that wise men, often identified with the 7 sages or Apkallu of mythology, had preserved critical knowledge by inscribing it on tablets and burying them before the disaster. After the flood, these tablets were recovered and became the foundation of post-diluvian civilization. Temple archives saw themselves as maintaining this recovered wisdom, preventing its second loss. Whether this tradition reflected actual historical memory or mythologized explanation for the origins of knowledge remains debatable. But the priests themselves clearly believed in the antediluvian source of their most sacred texts. They marked certain tablets as pre-flood originals or copies of such originals. They described the knowledge as coming from before the waters rose, from the time of the first fathers, from when the world was otherwise than it is now. The dedication of these archival priests to their preservation duty was remarkable. Through political upheavals, military conquests, changes of dynasty and empire, the temple archives continued their work. When Babylon fell to the Assyrians, the archives were maintained. When the Assyrians were conquered by the Medes and Persians, scribes continued copying ancient tablets. Even as cuneiform writing fell out of general use, replaced by alphabetic scripts, temple specialists maintained the ability to read and copy the old texts. The final generations of cuneiform scribes, working in the early centuries of the Common Era, understood they were likely the last. Several late colophons include poignant acknowledgements that the tradition was ending, that fewer students were being trained, that knowledge was being lost despite their best efforts. One late tablet from Babylon, dated to approximately the 1st century CE, carries a colophon reading, "This copy may be the last. Few remain who can read these signs, but I preserve them nonetheless, hoping that someday, in a future I cannot see, these ancient maps and measurements will again be understood by those who seek to know what the world once was and how the ancient fathers measured it." That hope was, in a sense, fulfilled. Modern archaeologists recovered the tablets, deciphered the cuneiform, and began examining the geographic and mathematical knowledge they contained. But the full understanding those ancient priests hoped for remains elusive. We can read the signs, we can recognize maps and coordinates, but we struggle to explain how such sophisticated knowledge came to exist in periods we consider too early for such capabilities, or what civilization created the original surveys that the Sumerians and their successors so carefully copied. And so the mystery persists, preserved through thousands of years of dedicated copying by priests who understood they were maintaining something precious, even when they couldn't fully comprehend it themselves. Knowledge from an age before their own, maps of a world that perhaps no longer existed, but that once had been measured with precision, that still, after all these millennia, commands respect and raises questions we have not yet found ways to answer. And so we drift now toward the edge of sleep, carried on currents that flow backward through time, past the crumbling ziggurats and silent tells of Iraq, past the moment when the last cuneiform scribe set down his stylus, past even the Sumerians themselves, towards sources we can glimpse but never quite reach. The maps remain, fragments of baked clay scattered across museum collections, their precision unexplained, their origins lost to the depths of prehistory. They whisper of civilizations that watched the stars with the same intensity we do, that measured the earth with care that still resonates across millennia, that understood their knowledge was precious enough to preserve even as their world transformed around them. Coastlines shifting, waters rising, the familiar geography of their time slowly drowning beneath seas that would cover it for thousands of years. Perhaps what troubles us most about these ancient maps is not their impossibility, but their familiarity. They used mathematics we recognize. They solved problems we still solve. They mapped a world that, beneath all the changes, remains the same world we inhabit. Across 5,000 years, across the vast gulf separating their civilization from ours, we recognize in their careful notations the same human impulse that drives us, the need to know, to measure, to understand, to preserve what we've learned so that those who come after might not have to rediscover it from nothing. The Sumerian priests who copied these maps in dim temple archives, pressing fresh marks into wet clay by lamplight, believed they were maintaining a sacred trust. They saw themselves as links in a chain reaching back to sources almost unimaginably ancient even to them. And now we hold those same tablets, their clay hardened by time and fire, and we become the next link in that chain, trying to understand what they preserved, trying to honor the dedication of countless scribes who believed this knowledge mattered enough to spend lifetimes ensuring it survived. So let yourself drift now towards sleep and dreams, under the same stars those ancient astronomers tracked with such precision. You're connected to them across the abyss of time, part of the same human story of curiosity and wonder, of watching the heavens and measuring the earth, of trying to understand the mysteries that surround us. The maps will still be there when you wake, waiting in their museum cases, holding questions that have persisted for millennia and may persist for millennia more. But for now, rest. Let the ancient world fade into the gentle darkness of sleep. The mysteries will keep. They can wait a little longer, patient as stone, silent as clay, while you drift away into dreams of coastlines that vanished beneath rising waters, of knowledge preserved across ages, of civilizations that mapped the world and left us wondering how they knew what they knew, and whether we'll ever fully understand the wisdom they worked so hard to save. Rest now. The ancient watchers in the temples have done their work. The knowledge is preserved, and you, like them, are part of something larger than any single lifetime, connected across time to everyone who has ever looked up at the stars and wondered, or looked out at the horizon and tried to measure what lay beyond. Sleep well.